up it like great green flies. Letting himself upon the ramp, he descended warily. The rosy cloud lapped about his ankles, descending as he lowered himself. It reached his knees, his thighs, his waist, his armpits. He felt as one feels a thick, heavy fog on a damp night. With it lapping about his chin, he hesitated and then ducked under. Instantly, his breath ceased. All air was shut off from him, and he felt his ribs caving in on his vitals. With a frantic effort, he heaved himself up, fighting for life. His head rose above the surface, and he drank air in great gulps. Karim Shah leaned down toward him and spoke to him, but Conan neither heard nor heeded. Stubbornly, his mind fixed on what the dying Kemsa had told him, the Cimmerian groped for the gold vein and found that he had moved off it in his descent. Several series of handholds were niched in the ram. Placing himself directly over the thread, he began climbing down once more. The rosy mist rose about him, engulfed him. Now his head was under, but he was still drinking pure air. Above him, he saw his companions staring down at him, their features blurred by the haze that shimmered over his head. He gestured for them to follow and went down swiftly without waiting to see whether they complied or not. Karim Shah sheathed his sword without comment and followed, and the Erksai, more fearful of being left alone than of the terrors that might lurk below, scrambled after him. Each man clung to the golden thread as they saw the Cimmerian do. Down the slanting ramp they went to the ravine floor and moved out across the shining level, treading the gold vein like rope walkers. It was as if they walked through an invisible tunnel through which air circulated freely. They felt death pressing in on them above and on either hand, but it did not touch them. The vein crawled up a similar ramp on the other wall, up which the acolytes had disappeared, and up it they went with taut nerves, not knowing what might be waiting for them among the jutting spurs of rocks that fanged the lip of the precipice. It was the green-robed acolytes who awaited them, with knives in their hands. Perhaps they had reached the limits to which they could retreat. Perhaps the Stygian girdle about Conan's waist could have told why their necromantic spells had proven so weak and so quickly exhausted. Perhaps it was knowledge of death decreed for failure that sent them leaping from among the rocks, eyes glaring and knives glittering, resorting in their desperation to material weapons. There, among the rocky fangs on the precipice lip, was no war of wizardcraft. It was a whirl of blades where real steel bit and real blood spurted, and where sinewy arms dealt forthright blows that severed quivering flesh, and men went down to be trodden underfoot as the fight raged over them. One of the Erksai bled to death among the rocks, but the acolytes were down, slashed and hacked asunder, or hurled over the edge to float sluggishly down to the silver floor that shone so far below. Then the conquerors shook the blood and sweat from their eyes and looked at one another. Conan and Karim Shah still stood upright, and 4 of the Erksai. They stood among the rocky teeth that serrated the precipice brink, and from that spot a path wound up a gentle slope to a broad stair, consisting of half a dozen steps, 100 feet across, cut out of a green jade-like substance. They led up to a broad stage or roofless galley of the same polished stone, and above it rose, tier upon tier, the castle of the Black Seers. It seemed to have been carved out of the sheer stone of the mountain. The architecture was faultless, but unadorned. The many casements were barred and masked with curtains within. There was no sign of life, friendly or hostile. They went up the path in silence, and warily as men treading the lair of a serpent. The Erksai were dumb, like men marching to a certain doom. Even Karim Shah was silent. Only Conan seemed unaware of what a monstrous dislocating and uprooting of accepted thought and action their invasion constituted, what an unprecedented violation of tradition. He was not of the East, and he came of a breed who fought devils and wizards as promptly and matter-of-factly as they battled human foes. He strode up the shining stairs and across the wide green gallery straight toward the great golden-bound teak door that opened upon it. He cast but a single glance upward at the higher tiers of the great pyramidal structure towering above him. He reached a hand for the bronze prong that jutted like a handle from the door, then checked himself, grinning hardly. The handle was made in the shape of a serpent, head lifted on arched neck, and Conan had a suspicion that that metal head would come to grisly life under his hand. He struck it from the door with one blow, and its bronze clink on the glassy floor did not lessen his caution. He flipped it aside with his knife point and turned again to the door. Utter silence reigned over the towers. Far below them, the mountain slopes fell away into a purple haze of distance. The sun glittered on snow-clad peaks on either hand. High above, a vulture hung like a black dot in the cold blue of the sky. But for it, the men before the gold-bound doors were the only evidence of life. Tiny figures on the jade-green gallery poised on the dizzy height, with that fantastic pile of stone towering above them. A sharp wind off the snow slashed them, whipping their tatters about. Conan's long knife splintering through the teak panels aroused the startled echoes. Again and again he struck, hewing through polished wood and metal bands alike. Through the sundered ruins he glared into the interior, alert and suspicious as a wolf. He saw a broad chamber, the polished stone walls untapestried, the mosaic floor uncarpeted. Square, polished ebon stools and a stone dais formed the only furnishings. The room was empty of human life. Another door opened in the opposite wall. "Leave a man on guard outside," grunted Conan. "I'm going in." Kerim Shah designated a warrior for that duty, and the man fell back toward the middle of the gallery, bow in hand. Conan strode into the castle, followed by the Turanian and the three remaining Urksai. The one outside spat, grumbled in his beard, and then startled suddenly as a low, mocking laugh reached his ears. He lifted his head and saw, on the tier above him, a tall, black-robed figure, naked head nodding slightly as he stared down. His whole attitude suggested mockery and malignity. Quick as a flash, the Urksai bent his bow and loosed, and the arrow streaked upward to strike full in the black-robed breast. The mocking smile did not alter. The seer plucked out the missile and threw it back at the bowman, not as a weapon is hurled, but with a contemptuous gesture. The Urksai dodged, instinctively throwing up his arm. His fingers closed on the revolving shaft. Then he shrieked. In his hand, the wooden shaft suddenly writhed. Its rigid outline became pliant, melting in his grasp. He tried to throw it from him, but it was too late. He held a living serpent in his naked hand, and already it had coiled about his wrist, and its wicked wedge-shaped head darted at his muscular arm. He shrieked again, and his eyes became distended, his features purple. He went to his knees, shaken by an awful convulsion, and then lay still. The men inside had wheeled at his first cry. Conan took a swift stride toward the open doorway and then halted short, baffled. To the men behind him it seemed that he strained against empty air, but though he could see nothing, there was a slick, smooth, hard surface under his hands, and he knew that a sheet of crystal had been let down in the doorway. Through it he saw the Urksai lying motionless on the glassy gallery, an ordinary arrow sticking in his arm. Conan lifted his knife and smoked, and the watchers were dumbfounded to see his blow checked apparently in midair with the loud clang of steel that meets an unyielding resistance. He wasted no more effort. He knew that not even the legendary Tolwar of Amir Kurum could shatter that invisible curtain. In a few words he explained the matter to Kerim Shah, and the Turanian shrugged his shoulders. "Well, if our exit is barred, we must find another. In the meanwhile, our way lies forward, does it not?" With a grunt, the Cimmerian turned and strode across the chamber to the opposite door, with a feeling of treading on the threshold of doom. As he lifted his knife to shatter the door, it swung silently open as if of its own accord. He strode into the great hall, flanked with tall, glassy columns. 100 feet from the door began the broad, jade-green steps of a stair that tapered toward the top like the side of a pyramid. What lay beyond that stair he could not tell. But between him and its shimmering foot stood a curious altar of gleaming black jade. 4 great golden serpents twined their tails about this altar and reared their wedge-shaped heads in the air, facing the 4 quarters of the compass like the enchanted guardians of a fabled treasure. But on the altar, between the arching necks, stood only a crystal globe filled with a cloudy smoke-like substance, in which floated 4 golden pomegranates. The sight stirred some distant recollection in his mind. Then Conan heeded the altar no longer, for on the lower steps of the stair stood 4 black-robed figures. He had not seen them come. They were simply there, tall, gaunt, their vulture heads nodding in unison, their feet and hands hidden by their flowing garments. One lifted his arm, and the sleeve fell away, revealing his hand, and it was not a hand at all. Conan halted in mid-stride, compelled against his will. He had encountered a force differing subtly from Kemsa's mesmerism, and he could not advance, though he felt it in his power to retreat if he wished. His companions had likewise halted, and they seemed even more helpless than he, unable to move in either direction. The seer whose arm was lifted beckoned to one of the Erxai, and the man moved toward him like one in a trance, eyes staring and fixed, blade hanging in limp fingers. As he pushed past Conan, the Cimmerian threw an arm across his breast to arrest him. Conan was so much stronger than the Erxai that in ordinary circumstances he could have broken his spine between his hands, but now the muscular arm was brushed aside like straw, and the Erxai moved toward the stair, treading jerkily and mechanically. He reached the steps and knelt stiffly, proffering his blade and bending his head. The seer took the sword. It flashed as he swung it up and down. The Erxai's head tumbled from his shoulders and thudded heavily on the black marble floor. An arch of blood jetted from the severed arteries, and the body slumped over and lay with arms spread wide. Again a malformed hand lifted and beckoned, and another Erxai stumbled stiffly to his doom. The ghastly drama was reenacted, and another headless form lay beside the first. As the third tribesman clumped his way past Conan to his death, a Cimmerian, his veins bulging in his temples with the effort to break past the unseen barrier that held him, was suddenly aware of allied forces, unseen but waking into life about him. This realization came without warning, but so powerfully that he could not doubt his instinct. His left hand involuntarily slid under his Vacaria belt and closed on the Stygian girdle. And as he gripped it, he felt new strength flood his numbed limbs. The will to live was a pulsing white-hot fire, matched by the intensity of his burning rage. The third Erxai was a decapitated corpse, and the hideous finger was lifting again when Conan felt the bursting of the invisible barrier. A fierce, involuntary cry burst from his lips as he leaped with the explosive suddenness of pent-up ferocity. His left hand gripped the sorcerer's girdle as a drowning man grips a floating log, and the long knife was a sheen of light in his right. The men on the steps did not move. They watched calmly, cynically. If they felt surprise, they did not show it. Conan did not allow himself to think what might chance when he came within knife reach of them. His blood was pounding in his temples. A mist of crimson swam before his sight. He was afire with the urge to kill, to drive his knife deep into flesh and bone and twist the blade in blood and entrails. Another dozen strides would carry him to the steps where the sneering demon stood. He drew his breath deep, his fury rising redly as his charge gathered momentum. He was hurtling past the altar with its golden serpents when, like a levin flash, there shot across his mind again, as vividly as if spoken in his external ear, the cryptic words of Kemsa. Break the crystal wall.
First one rolled up.
His reaction was almost without his own volition. Execution followed impulse so spontaneously that the greatest sorcerer of the age would not have had time to read his mind and prevent his action. Wheeling like a cat from his headlong charge, he brought his knife crashing down upon the crystal. Instantly the air vibrated with a peal of terror, whether from the stairs, the altar, or the crystal itself, he could not tell. Hisses filled his ears as the golden serpent, suddenly vibrant with hideous life, writhed and smote at him. But he was fired to the speed of a maddened tiger. A whirl of steel sheared through the hideous trunks that waved toward him, and he smote the crystal sphere again and yet again. And the globe burst with a noise like a thunderclap, raining fiery shards on the black marble, and the gold pomegranates, as if released from captivity, shot upward toward the lofty roof, and were gone. A mad screaming, bestial and ghastly, was echoing through the great hall.
Number one
On the
rolled
steps
up.
writhed four
number
black-robed figures, twisting in
then
convulsions,
we'll do
froth dripping from their
dab
livid
or three.
mouths. Then, with one frenzied crescendo of inhuman ululation, they stiffened and lay still, and Conan knew that they were dead. He stared down at the altar and the crystal shards. Four headless golden serpents still coiled about the altar, but no alien life now animated the dully gleaming metal. Kerim Shah was rising slowly from his knees, whither he had been dashed by some unseen force. He shook his head to clear the ringing from his ears. "Did you hear that crash when you struck? It was as if 1,000 crystal panels shattered all over the castle as the globe burst. Were the souls of the wizards imprisoned in those golden balls? Ha!" Conan wheeled as Kerim Shah drew his sword and pointed. Another figure stood at the head of the stairs. His robe too was black, but of richly embroidered velvet, and there was a velvet cap on his head. His face was calm and not unhandsome. "Who the devil are you?" demanded Conan, staring up at him, knife in hand. "I am the master of Yimsha." His voice was like the chime of a temple bell, but a note of cruel mirth ran through it. "Where is Yasmina?" demanded Karim Shah. The master
Right?
laughed down at him. "What is that to you, dead man? Have you so quickly forgotten my strength, once lent to you, that you come armed against me, you poor fool? I think I will take your heart, Karim Shah." He held out his hand as if to receive something, and the Turanian cried out sharply like a man in mortal agony. He reeled drunkenly, and then, with a splintering of bones, a rending of flesh and muscle, and a snapping of male links, his breast burst outward with a shower of blood, and through the ghastly aperture something red and dripping shot through the air into the master's outstretched hand, as a bit of steel leaps to a magnet. The Turanian slumped to the floor and lay motionless, and the master laughed and hurled the object to fall before Conan's feet, the still quivering human heart. With a roar and a curse, Conan charged the stair. From Kemsa's girdle he felt strength and deathless hate flow into him to combat the terrible emanation of power that met him on the steps. The air filled with a shimmering steely haze through which he plunged like a swimmer, head lowered, left arm bent about his face, knife gripped low in his right hand. His half-blinded eyes, glaring over the crook of his elbow, made out the hated shape of the seer before and above him, the outline wavering as a reflection wavers in disturbed water. He was racked and torn by forces beyond his comprehension, but he felt a driving power outside and beyond his own, lifting him inexorably onward and upward, despite the wizard's strength and his own agony. Now he had reached the head of the stairs, and the master's face floated in the steely haze before him, and a strange fear shadowed the inscrutable eyes. Conan waded through the mist as through a surf, and his knife lunged upward like a live thing. The keen point ripped the master's robe as he sprang back with a low cry. Then, before Conan's gaze, the wizard vanished, simply disappeared like a burst bubble, and something long and undulating darted up one of the smaller stairs that led up to the left and right from the landing. Conan charged after it, up the left-hand stair, uncertain as to what he had seen whip up those steps, but in a berserk mood that drowned the nausea and horror whispering at the back of his consciousness. He plunged out into a broad corridor whose uncarpeted floor and untapestried wall were of polished jet, and something long and swift whisked down the corridor ahead of him and into a curtained door. From within the chamber rose a scream of urgent terror. The sound lent wings to Conan's flying feet, and he hurtled through the curtains and headlong into the chamber within. A frightful scene met his glare. Yasmina cowered on the further edge of a velvet-covered dais, screaming her loathing and horror, an arm uplifted as if to ward off attack, while before her swayed the hideous head of a giant serpent, shining neck arching up from dark, gleaming coils. With a choked cry, Conan threw his knife. Instantly the monster whirled and was upon him, like the rush of wind through tall grass. The long knife quivered in its neck, point and a foot of blade showing on one side, and the hilt and a hand's breadth of steel on the other, but it only seemed to madden the giant reptile. The great head towered above the man who faced it, and then darted down, the venom-dripping jaws gaping wide. But Conan had plucked a dagger from his girdle, and he stabbed upward as the head dipped down. Point tore through the lower jaw and transfixed the upper, pinning them together. The next instant the great trunk had looped itself around the Cimmerian as the snake, unable to use its fangs, employed its remaining form of attack. Conan's left arm was pinioned among the bone-crushing folds, but his right was free. Bracing his feet to keep upright, he reached forth his hand, gripped the hilt of the long knife jutting from the serpent's neck, and tore it free in a shower of blood. As if divining his purpose with more than bestial intelligence, the snake writhed and knotted, seeking to cast its loops around the right arm. But with the speed of light, the long knife rose and fell, shearing halfway through the reptile's giant trunk. Before he could strike again, the great pliant loops fell away from him, and the monster dragged itself across the floor, gushing blood from its ghastly wounds. Conan sprang after it, knife lifted, but his vicious swipe cut empty air as the serpent writhed away from him and struck its blunt nose against a paneled screen of sandalwood. One of the panels gave inward, and the long, bleeding barrel whipped through it and was gone. Conan instantly attacked the screen. A few blows rent it apart, and he glared into the dim alcove beyond. No horrific shape coiled there. There was blood on the marble floor, and bloody tracks led to a cryptic arched door. Those tracks were of a man's bare feet. "Conan!" He whirled back into the chamber, just in time to catch the Devi Avenger in his arms as she rushed across the room and threw herself upon him. catching him about the neck with a frantic clasp, half hysterical with terror and gratitude and relief. His wild blood had been stirred to its uttermost by all that had passed. He caught her to him in a grasp that would have made her wince at another time, and crushed her lips with his. She made no resistance. The Devi was drowned in the elemental woman. She closed her eyes and drank in his fierce, hot, lawless kisses with all the abandon of passionate thirst. She was panting with his violence when he ceased for breath and glared down at her, lying limp in his mighty arms. "I knew you'd come for me," she murmured. "You would not leave me in this den of devils." At her words, recollection of their environment came to him suddenly. He lifted his head and listened intently. Silence reigned over the castle of Yimsha, but it was a silence impregnated with menace. Peril crouched in every corner, leering invisibly from every hanging. "We'd better go while we can," he muttered. "Those cuts were enough to kill any common beast or man, but a wizard has a dozen lives. Wound one and he writhes away like a crippled snake to suck up fresh venom from some source of sorcery." He picked up the girl, and carrying her in his arms like a child, he strode out into the gleaming jade corridor and down the stairs, nerves tautly alert for any sign or sound. "I met the master," she whispered, clinging to him and shuddering. "He worked his spells on me to break my will. The most awful thing was a moldering corpse which seized me in its arms. I fainted then and lay as one dead, I do not know how long. Shortly after I regained consciousness, I heard sounds of strife below and cries, and then that snake came slithering through the curtains. Ah!" She shook at the memory of that horror. "I knew somehow that it was not an illusion, but a real serpent that sought my life." "It was not a shadow, at least," answered Conan cryptically. "He knew he was beaten and chose to slay you rather than let you be rescued." "What do you mean, he?" she asked uneasily, and then shrank against him, crying out and forgetting her question. She had seen the corpses at the foot of the stairs. Those of the seers were not good to look at, as they lay twisted and contorted. Their hands and feet were exposed to view, and at the sight Yasmina went livid and hid her face against Conan's powerful shoulder. Chapter 10. Yasmina and Conan. Conan passed through the hall quickly enough, traversed the outer chamber, and approached the door that led upon the gallery. Then he saw the floor sprinkled with tiny glittering shards, and he remembered the crystal sheet that had covered the doorway had been shivered to bits, and he remembered the crash that had accompanied the shattering of that crystal globe. He believed that every piece of crystal in the castle had broken in that instant, and some dim instinct or memory of esoteric lore vaguely suggested the truth of the monstrous connection between the Lords of the Black Circle and the Golden Kingdom. He felt a short hair bristle chilly at the back of his neck and put the matter hastily out of his mind. He breathed a deep sigh of relief as he stepped out upon the green jade gallery. There was still the gorge to cross, but at least he could see the white peaks glistening in the sun and the long slopes falling away into the distant blue hazes. The Uxie lay where he had fallen, an ugly blotch on the glassy smoothness. As Conan strode down the winding path, he was surprised to note the position of the sun. It had not yet passed its zenith, and yet it seemed that hours had passed since he had plunged into the castle of the Black Seers. He felt an urge to hasten, not a mere blind panic, but an instinct of peril growing behind his back. He said nothing to Yasmina, and she seemed content to nestle her dark head against his arching breast and find security in the clasp of his iron arms. He paused an instant on the brink of the chasm, frowning down. The haze which danced in the gorge was no longer rose-hued and sparkling. It was smoky, dim, ghostly, like the life tide that flickered thinly in a wounded man. The thought came vaguely to Conan that the spells of magicians were more closely bound to their personal beings than were the actions of common men to the actors. But far below, the floor shone like tarnished silver, and the gold thread sparkled undimmed. Conan shifted Yasmina across his shoulder where she lay docilely and began the descent. Hurriedly he descended the ramp. Hurriedly he fled across the echoing floor. He had a conviction that they were racing with time, that their chances of survival depended upon crossing that gorge of horrors before the wounded master of the castle should regain enough power to loose some other doom upon them. When he toiled up the farther ramp and came out upon the crest, he breathed a gusty sigh of relief and stood Yasmina upon her feet. "You walk from here?" he told her. It's downhill all the way. She stole a glance at the gleaming pyramid across the chasm. It reared up against the snowy slope like the citadel of silence and immemorial evil. Are you a magician that you have conquered the black seers of Yemsha, Conan of Kor? She asked as they went down the path, with his heavy arm about her supple waist. It was a girdle Kemsha gave me before he died, Conan answered. Yes, I found him on the trail. It is a curious one, which I will show you when I have time. Against some spells it was weak, but against others it was strong. And a good knife is always a hearty incantation. But if the girdle aided you in conquering the master, she argued, why did it not aid Kemsha? He shook his head. Who knows? But Kemsha had been the master's slave. Perhaps that weakened his magic. He had no hold on me as he had on Kemsha. Yet I can't say that I conquered him. He retreated, but I have a feeling that we haven't seen the last of him. I want to put as many miles between us and his lair as we can. He was further relieved to find the horses tethered among the tamarisks as he had left them. He loosed them swiftly and mounted the black stallion, swinging the girl up before him. The others followed, freshened by their rest. And what now? She asked. To Afghanistan? Not just now. He grinned hardly. Somebody, maybe the governor, killed my 7 headmen. My idiotic followers think I had something to do with it, and unless I'm able to convince them otherwise, they'll hunt me like a wounded dog. Then what of me? If the headmen are dead, I'm useless to you as a hunter. Will you slay me for them? He looked down at her with eyes fiercely aglow and laughed at the suggestion. Then let us ride to the border, she said. You'll be safe from the Afghulis there. Yes, on the Vengian gibbet. I am Queen of Vengia, she reminded him with a touch of her old imperiousness. You have saved my life. You shall be rewarded. She did not intend it as it sounded, but he growled in his throat, ill pleased. You're bounty for your city-bred dogs, princess. If you're a queen of the plains, I'm a chief of the hills, and not 1 foot toward the border will I take you. But you would be safe, she began bewildered. And you'd be the Devi again, he broke in. No, girl. I prefer you as you are now, a woman of flesh and blood, riding on my saddle bow. But you can't keep me, she cried. You can't. Watch and see, he advised grimly. But I will pay you a vast ransom. Devil take your ransom, he answered roughly, his arms hardening about his supple figure. The kingdom of Vengia could give me nothing I desire half so much as I desire you. I took you at the risk of my neck. If your courtiers want you that, let them come up the Jaibar and fight for you. But you have no followers now, she protested. You are hunted. How can you preserve your own life, much less mine? I still have friends in the hills, he answered. There is a chief of the Kurakzai who will keep you safely while I bicker with the Afghulis. If they will have none of me, by Kram I will ride northward with you to the steppes of the Kozaki. I was a hetman among the free companions before I rode southward. I'll make you a queen on the Zaparaska River. But I cannot, she objected. You must not hold me. If the idea is so repulsive, he demanded, why did you yield your lips to me so willingly? Even a queen is human, she answered, coloring. But because I am a queen, I must consider my kingdom. Do not carry me away into some foreign country. Come back to Vengia with me. Would you make me your king? He asked, sardonically. Well, there are customs, she stammered, and he interrupted her with a hard laugh. Yes, civilized customs that won't let you do as you wish. You'll marry some withered old king of the plains, and I can go my way with only the memory of a few kisses snatched from your lips. Ha! But I must return to my kingdom, she repeated helplessly. Why? He demanded angrily. To chafe your rump on gold thrones and listen to the plaudits of smirking velvet-skirted fools? Where is the gain? Listen, I was born in the Cimmerian hills where the people are all barbarians. I have been a mercenary soldier, a corsair, a Cossack, and 100 other things. What king has roamed the countries, fought the battles, loved the women, and won the plunder that I have? I came into Gulistan to raise a horde and plunder the kingdoms of the south, your own and mine. Being chief of the Afghulis was only a start. If I can conciliate them, I'll have a dozen tribes following me within a year. But if I can't, I'll ride back to the steppes and loot the Turanian borders with the Kozaki. And you'll go with me. To the devil with your kingdom. They fended for themselves before you were born. She lay in his arms looking up at him, and she felt a tug at her spirit, a lawless, reckless edge that matched his own, and was by it called into being. But 1,000 generations of sovereignship rode heavy upon her. I can't, she repeated helplessly. You haven't any choice, he assured her. You, what the devil? They had left Yimsha some miles behind them and were riding along a high ridge that separated two deep valleys. They had just topped a steep crest where they could gaze down into the valley on their right hand, and there was a running fight in progress. A strong wind was blowing away from them, carrying the sound from their ears, but even so the clashing of steel and thunder of hoofs welled up from far below. They saw the glint of the sun on lance-tip and spired helmet. 3,000 male horsemen were driving before them, a ragged band of turbaned riders who fled snarling and striking like fleeing wolves. Turanians, muttered Conan. Squadrons from Secunderam. What the devil are they doing here? Who are the men they pursue? Asked Yasmina. Why do they fall back so stubbornly? They cannot stand against such odds. 500 of my mad Afghulis, he growled, scowling down into the vale. They're in a trap and they know it. The valley was indeed a cul-de-sac at that end. It narrowed to a high-walled gorge, opening out further into a round bowl, completely rimmed with lofty, unscalable walls. The turbaned riders were being forced into this gorge because there was nowhere else for them to go, and they went reluctantly, in a shower of arrows and a whirl of swords. The helmeted riders harried them, but did not press in too rashly. They knew the desperate fury of the hill tribes, and they knew, too, that they had their prey in a trap from which there was no escape. They had recognized the hillmen as Afghulis, and they wished to hem them in and force a surrender. They needed hostages for the purpose they had in mind. Their emir was a man of decision and initiative. When he reached the Guru Shah Valley and found neither guides nor emissary waiting for him, he pushed on, trusting to his own knowledge of the country. All the way from Secunderam there had been fighting, and tribesmen were licking their wounds in many a crag-perched village. He knew there was a good chance that neither he nor any of his helmeted spearmen would ever ride through the gates of Secunderam again, for the tribes would all be up behind him now. But he was determined to carry out his orders, which were to take Yasmina Devi from the Afghulis at all costs and bring her captive to Secunderam, or, if confronted by impossibility, to strike off her head before he himself died. Of all this, of course, the watchers on the ridge were not aware, but Conan fidgeted with nervousness. Why the devil did they get themselves trapped? He demanded of the universe at large. I know what they're doing in these parts. They were hunting me, the dogs, poking into every valley, and found themselves penned in before they knew it. The poor fools. They're making a stand in the gorge, but they can't hold out for long. When the Turanians have pushed them back into the bowl, they'll slaughter them at their leisure. The din welling up from below increased in volume and intensity. In the strait of the narrow gut, the Afghulis, fighting desperately, were for the time holding their own against the mailed riders, who could not throw their whole weight against them. Conan scowled darkly, moved restlessly, fingering his hilt, and finally spoke bluntly. Devi, I must go down to them. I'll find a place for you to hide until I come back to you. You spoke of your kingdom. Well, I don't pretend to look on those hairy devils as my children, but after all, such as they are, they're my henchmen. A chief should never desert his followers, even if they desert him first. They think they were right in kicking me out. Hell, I won't be cast off. I'm still chief of the Afghulis, and I'll prove it. I can climb down on foot into the gorge. But what of me? She queried. You carried me away forcibly from my people. Now you will leave me to die in the hills alone? Will you go down and sacrifice yourself uselessly? His veins swelled with the conflict of his emotions. That's right, he muttered helplessly. Crom knows what I can do. She turned her head slightly, a curious expression dawning on her beautiful face. Then, listen, she cried, listen. A distant fanfare of trumpets was borne faintly to their ears. They stared into the deep valley on the left and caught a glint of steel on the farther side. A long line of lances and polished helmets moved along the vale, gleaming in the sunlight. The riders of Vendya, she cried exultingly. There are thousands of them, muttered Conan. It has been long since a Kshatriya host has ridden this far into the hills. They are searching for me, she exclaimed. Give me your horse. I will ride to my warrior. The ridge is not so precipitous on the left, and I can reach the valley floor. I will lead my horsemen into the valley at the upper end and fall upon the Turanians. We will crush them in a vice. Quick, Conan! Will you sacrifice your men to your own desire? The burning hunger of the steppes and the wintry forest glared out of his eyes, but he shook his head and swung off the stallion, placing the reins in her hands. You win, he grunted. Ride like the devil. She wheeled away down the left-hand slope, and he ran swiftly along the ridge until he reached the long, ragged cleft that was the defile in which the fight raged. Down the rugged wall he scrambled like an ape, clinging to projections and crevices, to fall at last feet first into the melee that raged in the mouth of the gorge. Blades were whickering and clanging about him, horses rearing and stamping, helmet plumes nodding among turbans that were stained crimson. As he hit, he yelled like a wolf, caught a gold-worked rein, and dodging the sweep of a scimitar, drove his long knife upward through the rider's vitals. In another instant he was in the saddle, yelling ferocious orders to the Afghulis. They stared at him stupidly for an instant. Then, as they saw the havoc his steel was wreaking among their enemies, they fell to work again, accepting him without comment. In that inferno of licking blades and spurting blood, there was no time to ask or answer questions. The riders in their spired helmets and gold-worked hauberks swarmed about the gorge mouth, thrusting and slashing, and the narrow defile was packed and jammed with horses and men. The warriors crushed breast to breast, stabbing with shortened blades, slashing murderously when there was an instant's room to swing a sword. When a man went down, he did not get up from beneath the swirling, stamping hoofs. Weight and sheer strength counted heavily there, and the chief of the Afghulis did the work of 10. At such times, accustomed habits sway men strongly, and the warriors, who were used to seeing Conan in their vanguard, were heartened mightily despite their distrust of him. But superior numbers counted too. The pressure of the men behind forced the horsemen of Turan deeper and deeper into the gorge and the teeth of the flickering tulwars. Foot by foot the Afghulis were shoved back, leaving the defile floor carpeted with dead on which the riders trampled. As he hacked and smote like a man possessed, Conan had time for some chilling doubts. Would Yasmina keep her word? She had but to join her warriors, turn southward, and leave him and his band to perish. But at last, after what seemed centuries of desperate battle, in the valley outside there arose another sound above the clash of steel and yells of slaughter. And then, with a blast of trumpets that shook the walls and rushing thunder of hoofs, 5,000 riders of vengeance smote the forces of Secunderam. That stroke split the Turanian squadrons asunder, shattered, tore, and rent them, and scattered their fragments all over the valley. In an instant, the surge had ebbed back out of the gorge. There was a chaotic, confused swirl of fighting, horsemen wheeling and smiting singly and in clusters, and then the enemy down with the Kshatriya lance through his back. And the riders in their spired helmets turned their horses down the valley, spurring like mad and seeking to slash away through the swarms that would come upon them from the rear. As they scattered in flight, the conquerors scattered in pursuit, all across the valley floor, and up on the slopes near the mouth, and over the crests streamed the fugitives and the pursuers. The Afghulis, those left to ride, rushed out of the gorge and joined in the harrying of their foes, accepting the unexpected alliance as unquestioningly as they had accepted the return of their repudiated chief. The sun was sinking toward the distant crags when Conan, his garments hacked to tatters and lay under him, reeking and clotted with blood, his knife dripping and crusted to the hilt, strode over the corpses to where Yasmina Devi sat her horse among her nobles on the crest of the ridge, near a lofty precipice. "You kept your word, Devi," he roared. "By Crom, though, I had some bad seconds down in that gorge. Look out!" Down from the sky swooped a vulture of tremendous size with a thunder of wings that knocked men sprawling from their horses. The scimitar-like beak was slashing for the Devi's soft neck, but Conan was quicker. A short run, Irish leap, the savage thrust of a dripping knife, and the vulture voiced a horribly human cry, pitched sideways and went tumbling down the cliffs to the rocks and river 1,000 feet below. As it dropped, its black wings thrashing the air, it took on the semblance not of a bird, but of a black-robed human body that fell, arms in wide black sleeves thrown abroad. Conan turned to Yasmina, his red knife still in his hand, his blue eyes smoldering, blood oozing from wounds on his thickly muscled arms and thighs. "You are the Devi again," he said, grinning fiercely at the gold-clasped gossamer robe she had donned over her hill girl attire, and awed not at all by the imposing array of chivalry about her. I have you to thank for the lives of some 350 of my rogues, who are at least convinced that I didn't betray them. You have put my hands on the reign of conquest again. I still owe you my ransom, she said, her dark eyes glowing as they swept over him. 10,000 pieces of gold I will pay you. He made a savage, impatient gesture, shook the blood from his knife, and thrust it back in its scabbard, wiping his hands on his mail. I will collect your ransom in my own way at my own time, he said. I will collect it in your palace at Ayodhya, and I will come with 50,000 men to see that the scales are fair. She laughed, gathering her reins into her hands. And I will meet you on the shores of Jundag with 100,000. His eyes shone with fierce appreciation and admiration, and stepping back, he lifted his hand with a gesture that was like the assumption of danger, indicating that her road was clear before her. A Witch Shall Be Born. Howard wrote this long novelette. At 17,000 words, it almost qualifies as a short novella, right after sending his greatest hits novel, The Hour of the Dragon, off to an English publisher. It may have been intended as a sort of palate cleanser for him. It contains many of the elements of the middle period novelettes, but done better and with far more of an edge. There's a certain unstated hint at sadomasochistic lesbianism in the relationship between Taramis and her twin sister, and showing Conan crucified was, if anything, even more daring than that. This story, by the way, is the source for the vulture-biting scene in the 1982 movie Conan the Barbarian. A Witch Shall Be Born was first published in the December 1934 issue of Weird Tales magazine. Chapter 1. The Blood-Red Crescent. Taramis, Queen of Khauran, awakened from a dream-haunted slumber to a silence that seemed more like the stillness of nighted catacombs than the normal quiet of a sleeping place. She lay staring out into the darkness, wondering why the candles in their golden candelabra had gone out. A flecking of stars marked a gold-barred casement that lent no illumination to the interior of the chamber. But as Taramis lay there, she became aware of a spot of radiance glowing in the darkness before her. She watched, puzzled. It grew, and its intensity deepened as it expanded, a widening disk of lurid light hovering against the dark velvet hangings of the opposite wall. Taramis caught her breath, starting up to a sitting position. A dark object was visible in that circle of light. A human head. In a sudden panic, the queen opened her lips to cry out for her maids. Then she checked herself. The glow was more lurid, the head more vividly limbed. It was a woman's head, small, delicately molded, superbly poised, with a high-piled mass of lustrous black hair. The face grew distinct as she stared, and it was the sight of this face which froze the cry in Taramis's throat. The features were her own. She might have been looking into a mirror, which subtly altered her reflection, lending it a tigerish gleam of eye and instinctive curl of lip. "Ishtar!" gasped Taramis. "I am bewitched!" Appallingly, the apparition spoke, and its voice was like "Bewitched? No, sweet sister. Here is no sorcery." "Sister?" stammered the bewildered girl. "I have no sister." "You never had a sister?" came the sweet, poisonously mocking voice. "Never a twin sister whose breath was as soft as yours to caress or hurt?" "Why, once I had a sister," answered Taramis, still convinced that she was in the grip of some sort of nightmare. "But she died." The beautiful face in the disc was convulsed with the aspect of a fury. So hellish became its expression that Taramis, cowering back, half expected to see snaky locks writhe hissing about the ivory brow. "You lie!" The accusation was spat from between the snarling red lips. "She did not die! Fool! Oh, enough of this mummery! Look, and let your sight be blasted!" Light ran suddenly along the hangings like flaming serpents, and incredibly the candles and the golden sticks flared up again. Taramis crouched on her velvet couch, her lithe legs flexed beneath her, staring wide-eyed at the pantherish figure which posed mockingly before her. It was as if she gazed upon another Taramis, identical with herself in every contour of feature and limb, yet animated by an alien and evil personality. The face of this stranger waif reflected the opposite of every characteristic the countenance of the queen denoted. Lust and mystery sparkled in her scintillant eyes. Cruelty lurked in the curl of her full red lips. Every movement of her supple body was subtly suggestive. Her coiffure imitated that of the queen's. On her feet were gilded sandals such as Taramis wore in her boudoir. The sleeveless, low-necked silk tunic, girdled at the waist with a cloth of gold cincture, was a duplicate of the queen's night garment. "Who are you?" gasped Taramis, an icy chill that she could not explain creeping along her spine. "Decline your presence before I call my ladies-in-waiting to summon the guard." "Scream until the roof beams crack," callously answered the stranger. "Your sluts will not wake till dawn, though the palace spring into flames about them. Your guardsmen will not hear your squeals. They have been sent out of this wing of the palace." "What?" exclaimed Taramis, stiffening with outraged majesty. "Who dared give my guardsmen such a command?" "I did, sweet sister," sneered the other girl. "A little while ago, before I entered. They thought it was their darling, adored queen. Ha! How beautifully I acted the part. With what imperious dignity, softened by womanly sweetness, did I address the great louts who knelt in their armor and plumed helmets." Taramis felt as if a stifling net of bewilderment were being drawn about her. "Who are you?" she cried desperately. "What madness is this? Why do you come here?" "Who am I?"
Excuse me.
There was the spite of a sheep
It's
over his
round one.
hiss in the soft response. The girl stepped to the edge of the couch, grasped the queen's white shoulders with fierce fingers, and bent to glare full into the startled eyes of Taramis. And under the spell of that hypnotic glare, the queen forgot to resent the unprecedented outrage of violent hands laid on regal flesh. "Fool!" gritted the girl between her teeth. "Can you ask? Can you wonder? I am Salome." "Salome?" Taramis breathed the word, and the hairs prickled on her scalp as she realized the incredible, numbing truth of the statement. "I thought you died within the hour of your birth," she said feebly. "Not many," answered the woman who called herself Salome. "They carried me into the desert to die, damn them. I, a mewling, puling babe whose life was so young that it was scarcely the flicker of a candle. You know why they bore me forth to die?" "I have heard the story," faltered Taramis. Salome laughed fiercely and slapped her bosom. The low-necked tunic left the upper parts of her firm breast bare, and between them there shone a curious mark,
Gotta give it a little breather.
red as blood. "The mark of the witch!" cried Taramis, recoiling. "I..." Salome's laughter was dagger-edged with hate. "The curse of the kings of Khoran. Aye, they tell the tale in the marketplaces with wagging beards and rolling eyes, the pious fools. They tell how the first queen of our line had traffic with a fiend of darkness and bore him a daughter who lives in foul legendary to this day. And thereafter in each century a girl baby was born into the Ascarian dynasty, with a scarlet half-moon between her breasts that signified her destiny. Every century a witch shall be born. So ran the ancient curse, and so it has come to pass. Some were slain at birth as they sought to slay me. Some walked the earth as witches, proud daughters of Khoran, with moons of hell burning upon their ivory bosoms. Each was named Salome. I too am Salome. It will always be Salome, the witch, even when the mountains of ice have roared down from the pole and ground the civilizations to ruin, and a new world has risen from the ashes and dust. Even then there shall be Salomes to walk the earth, to trap men's hearts by their sorcery, to dance before the kings of the world, to see the heads of wise men fall at their pleasure." But you," stammered Taramis. "I?" The scintillant eyes burned like dark fires of mystery. "They carried me into the desert far from the city and laid me naked on the hot sand under the flaming sun. And then they rode away and left me for the jackals and the vultures and the desert wolves. But the life in me was stronger than the life of common folk, for it partakes in the essence of the forces that seethe in the black gulfs beyond mortal ken. The hours passed, and the sun slashed down like the molten flames of hell, but I did not die. Aye, something of that torment I remember, faintly and far away, as one remembers a dim, formless dream. Then there were camels, and yellow-skinned men who wore silk robes and spoke in a weird tongue. Straight from the caravan road they passed close by, and their leader saw me and recognized the scarlet crescent on my bosom. He took me up and gave me life. He was a magician from far Kitai, returning to his native kingdom after a journey to Stygia. He took me with him to purple-towered Paikang, its minarets rising amid the vine-festooned jungles of bamboo. And there I grew to womanhood under his teaching. Age had steeped him deep in black wisdom, not weakened his powers of evil. Many things he taught me. She paused, smiling enigmatically, with wicked mystery gleaming in her dark eyes. Then she tossed her head. He drove me from him at last, saying that I was but a common witch in spite of his teachings, and not fit to command the mighty sorcery he would have taught me. He would have made me queen of the world and ruled the nations through me, he said, but I was only a harlot of darkness. But what of it? I could never endure to seclude myself in a golden tower and spend the long hours staring into a crystal globe, mumbling over incantations written on serpent skin in the blood of virgins, poring over dusty volumes in forgotten languages. He said I was but an earthly sprite, knowing naught of the deeper gulfs of cosmic sorcery. Well, this world contains all I desire, power and pomp, and glittering pageantry, handsome men and soft women for my paramours and my slaves. He had told me who I was, of the curse, and my heritage. I have returned to take that, to which I have as much right as you. Now it is mine by right of possession. What do you mean? Taramis sprang up and faced her sister, startled for bewilderment and fright. Do you imagine that by drugging a few of my guardsmen you have established a claim to the throne of Khura'in? Do not forget that I am queen of Khura'in. I shall give you a place of honor as my sister, but... Salome laughed hatefully. How generous of you, dear sweet sister. But before you begin putting me in my place, perhaps you will tell me whose soldiers camp in the plain outside the city walls? They are the Shemitish mercenaries of Constantius, the Gothic voivode of the Free Companies. And what do they in Khura'in? Cooed Salome. Taramis felt that she was being subtly mocked, but she answered with an assumption of dignity which she scarcely felt. Constantius asked permission to pass along the borders of Khura'in on his way to Turan. He himself is hostage for their good behavior as long as they are within my domains.
Taps up.
And Constantius, pursued Salome, did he not ask for your hand today? Taramis shot her a clouded glance of suspicion. How did you know that? An insolent shrug of the slim, naked shoulders was the only reply. You refused, dear sister. Exclaimed Taramis angrily. Do you, an Ascarian princess yourself, suppose that the Queen of Khura'in could treat such a proposal with anything but disdain? A bloody-handed adventurer, a man exiled from his own kingdom because of his crimes, and the leader of organized plunderers and hired murderers? I should never have allowed him to bring his black-bearded slayers into Khura'in, but he is virtually a prisoner in the South Tower, guarded by my soldiers. Tomorrow I shall bid him order his troops to leave the kingdom. He himself shall be kept captive until they are over the border. Meanwhile, my soldiers man the walls of the city, and I have warned him that he will answer for any outrages perpetrated on the villagers or shepherds by his mercenaries. He is confined in the South Tower? Asked Salome. That is what I said. For answer, Salome clapped her hands and lifted her voice with a gurgle of cruel mirth in it, called, The Queen grants you an audience, Falcon. A gold arabesque door opened, and a tall figure entered the chamber, at the sight of which Taramis cried out in amazement and anger. Constantius, you dare enter my chamber! As you see, your majesty. He bent his dark, hawk-like head in mock humility. Constantius, whom men called Falcon, was tall, broad-shouldered, slim-waisted, lithe and strong as pliant steel. He was handsome in an aquiline, ruthless way. His face was burnt dark by the sun, and his hair, which grew far back from his high, narrow forehead, was black as a raven. His dark eyes were penetrating and alert, the hardness of his thin lips not softened by his thin lips and staff. His boots were of Cordovan leather, his hose and doublet of plain dark silk, tarnished with the wear of the camps and the stains of armor rust. Twirling his mustache, he let his gaze travel up and down the shrinking queen with an effrontery that made her wince. "By Ishtar, Taramis," he said silkily, "I find you more alluring in your night tunic than in your queenly robes. Truly this is an auspicious night." Fear grew in the queen's dark eyes. She was no fool. She knew that Constantius would never dare this outrage unless he was sure of himself. "You are mad," she said. "If I am in your power in this chamber, you are no less in the power of my subjects, who will rend you to pieces if you touch me. Go at once if you would live." Both laughed mockingly, and Salome made an impatient gesture. "Enough of this farce. Let us on to the next act in the comedy. Listen, dear sister. It was I who sent Constantius here. When I decided to take the throne of Coran, I cast about for a man to aid me, and chose the falcon because of his utter lack of all characteristics men call good." "I am overwhelmed, princess," murmured Constantius sardonically with a profound bow. "I sent him to Coran, and once his men were camped in the plain outside, and he was in the palace, I entered the city by that small gate in the west wall. The fools guarding it thought it was you, returning from some nocturnal adventure." "You hellcat!" Aramis' cheeks flamed, and her resentment grew better of her regal reserve. Salome smiled hardly. "They were properly surprised and shocked, but admitted me without question. I entered the palace the same way, and gave the order to the surprised guards that sent them marching away, as well as the men who guarded Constantius in the south tower. Then I came here, attending to the ladies-in-waiting on the way." Taramis' fingers clenched and she paled. "Well, what next?" she asked in a shaky voice. "Listen." Salome inclined her head. Faintly through the casement there came a clank of marching men in armor. Gruff voices shouted in an alien tongue, and cries of alarm mingled with the shouts. "The people awaken and grow fearful," said Constantius sardonically. "You had better go and reassure them, Salome." "Call me Taramis," answered Salome. "We must become accustomed to it." "What have you done?" "I have gone to the gates and ordered the soldiers to open them," answered Salome. "They were astounded, but they obeyed. That is the Falcon's army you hear, marching into the city." "You devil!" cried Taramis. "You have betrayed my people, in my guise. Oh, you have made me seem a traitor. Oh, I shall go to them." With a cruel laugh, Salome caught her wrist and jerked her back. The magnificent suppleness of the queen was helpless against the vindictive strength that steeled Salome's slender limbs. "You know how to reach the dungeons from the palace, Constantius," said the witch girl. "Good. Take this Spitfire and lock her in the strongest cell. The jailers are all sound and drugged to sleep. I saw to that. Send a man to cut their throats before they can awaken.
Give it a little
None
bit
must
for
ever know what has
round
occurred
two.
tonight. Thenceforward I am Taramis, and Taramis is a
Them dabs
nameless
kinda got
prisoner
me.
in an unknown dungeon." Constantius smiled with a glint of strong white teeth under his thin mustache. "Very good, but you would not deny me a little amusement first." "Not I. Tame the scornful hussy as you will." With a wicked laugh, Salome flung her sister into the Kothian's arms and turned away through the door that opened into the outer corridor. Fright widened Taramis' lovely eyes, her supple figure rigid and straining against Constantius' embrace. She forgot the men marching in the streets, forgot the outrage to her queenship in the face of the menace to her womanhood. She forgot all sensations but terror and shame as she faced the complete cynicism of Constantius' burning, mocking eyes, felt his hard arms crushing her writhing body. Salome, hurrying along the corridor outside, smiled spitefully as a scream of despair and agony rang shuddering through the palace. Chapter 2. The Tree of Death. The young soldier's hose and shirt were smeared with dried blood, wet with sweat and gray with dust. Blood oozed from the deep gash in his thigh, from the cuts on his breast and shoulder. Perspiration glistened on his livid face, and his fingers were knotted in the corner of the divan on which he lay. Yet his words reflected mental suffering that outweighed physical pain. "She must be mad," he repeated again and again, like one still stunned by some monstrous and incredible happening. It's like a nightmare. Taramis, whom all Quran loves, betraying her people to that devil from Koth. Oh, Ishtar, why was I not slain? Better die than live to see our queen turn traitor and harlot. Lie still, Valerius, begged the girl, who was washing and bandaging his wounds with trembling hands. Oh, please lie still, darling. You will make your wounds worse. I dared not summon a leech. No, muttered the wounded youth. Constantius's blue-bearded devils will be searching the quarters for wounded Korani. They'll hang every man who has wounds to show he fought against them. Oh, Daramus, how could you betray the people who worshipped you? In his fierce agony he writhed, weeping in rage and shame, and the terrified girl caught him in her arms, straining his tossing head against her bosom, imploring him to be quiet. Better death than the black shame that has come upon Quran this day, he groaned. Did you see it, Ivga? No, Valerius. Her soft, nimble fingers were again at work, gently cleansing and closing the gaping edges of his raw wounds. I was awakened by the noise of fighting in the streets. I looked out a casement and saw the Shemites cutting down people. Then, presently, I heard you calling me faintly from the alley door. I had reached the limits of my strength, he muttered. I fell in the alley and could not rise. I knew they'd find me soon if I lay there. I killed 3 of the blue-bearded beasts by Ishtar. They'll never swagger through Koran's streets by the gods. The fiends are tearing their hearts in hell. The trembling girl crooned soothingly to him, as to a wounded child, and closed his panting lips with her own cool, sweet mouth. But the fire that raged in his soul would not allow him to lie silent. I was not on the wall when the Shemites entered, he burst out. I was asleep in the barracks with the others not on duty. It was just before dawn when our captain entered, and his face was pale under his helmet. The Shemites are in the city, he said. The queen came to the southern gate and gave orders that they should be admitted. She made the men come down from the walls, where they've been on guard since Constantius entered the kingdom. I don't understand it, and neither does anyone else, but I heard her give the order, and we obeyed as we always do. We are ordered to assemble in the square before the palace, form ranks outside the barracks, and march. Leave your arms and armor here. Ishtar knows what this means, but it is the queen's order. Well, when we come to the square, the Shemites were drawn up on foot opposite the palace, 10,000 of the blue-bearded devils fully armed, and people's heads were thrust out of every window and door of the square. The streets leading into the square were thronged by bewildered folk. Taramis was standing on the steps of the palace, alone except for Constantius, who stood stroking his mustache like a great lean cat who's just devoured a sparrow. But 50 Shemites with bows in their hands were ranged around below them. That's where the queen's guard should have been. They were drawn up at the foot of the palace stairs, puzzled as we, though they had come fully armed in spite of the queen's order. Taramis spoke to us then and told us that she had reconsidered the proposal made her by Constantius. Why, only yesterday she threw it in his teeth in open court, and that she had decided to make him her royal consort. She did not explain why she had brought the Shemites into the city so treacherously, but she said that as Constantius had control of a body of professional fighting men, the army of Koran would no longer be needed, and therefore she disbanded it and ordered us to go quietly to our homes. Why, obedience to our queen is second nature to us, but we were struck dumb and found no words to answer. We broke ranks almost before we knew what we were doing, like men in a daze. But when the palace guard was ordered to disarm likewise and disband, the captain of the guard, Conan, interrupted. Men said he was off duty the night before and drunk, but he was wide awake now. He shouted to the guardsmen to stand as they were until they received an order from him, and such is his dominance of his men that they obeyed in spite of the queen. He strode up the steps and glared at Taramis, and then he roared, "This is not the queen, this isn't Taramis, it's some devil in masquerade." Then hell was to pay. I don't know just what happened. I think a Shemite struck Conan, and Conan killed him. The next instant the square was a battleground. The Shemites fell on the guardsmen, and their spears and arrows struck down many soldiers who had already disbanded. Some of us grabbed up such weapons as we could and fought back. We hardly knew what we were fighting for, but it was us against Constantius and his devils, not against Taramis, I swear it. Constantius shouted to cut the traitors down. We were not traitors. Despair and bewilderment shook his voice. The girl murmured pityingly, not understanding it all, but aching in sympathy with her lover's suffering. The people did not know which side to take. It was a madhouse of confusion and bewilderment. We who fought didn't have a chance, in no formation, without armor, and only half-armed. The guards were fully armed and drawn up in a square, but there were only 500 of them. They took a heavy toll before they were cut down, but there could only be one conclusion to such a battle. And while her people were being slaughtered before her, Taramis stood on the palace steps with Constantia's arm around her waist and laughed, like a heartless, beautiful fiend. God, it's all mad, mad. I never saw a man fight as Conan fought. He put his back to the courtyard wall, and before they overpowered him, the dead men were strewn in heaps thigh-deep around him. But at last they dragged him down 100 against 1. When I saw him fall, I dragged myself away, feeling as if the world had burst under my very fingers. I heard Constantius call to his dogs to take the captain alive, stroking his mustache with that hateful smile on his lips. That smile was on the lips of Constantius at that very moment. He sat his horse among a cluster of his men, thick-bodied Shemites with curled blue-black beards and hooked noses. The low swinging sun struck glints from their peaked helmets and the silvered scales of their corselets. Nearly a mile behind, the walls and towers of Khorran rose sheer out of the meadowlands. By the side of the caravan road, a heavy cross had been planted, and on this grim tree a man hung, nailed there by iron spikes through his hands and feet. Naked but for a loincloth, the man was almost a giant in stature, and his muscles stood out in thick corded ridges on limbs and body which the sun had long ago burned brown. The perspiration of agony bearded his face and his mighty breast, but from under the tangled black mane that fell over his low, broad forehead, his blue eyes blazed with an unquenchable fire. Blood oozed sluggishly from the lacerations in his hands and feet. Constantius saluted him mockingly. "I am sorry, Captain," he said, "that I cannot remain to ease your last hours, but I have duties to perform in yonder city. I must not keep your delicious queen waiting." He laughed softly. "So I leave you to your own devices, and these beauties." He pointed meaningly at black shadows which swept incessantly back and forth, high above. "Were it not for them, I imagine that a powerful brute like yourself should live on the cross for days. Do not cherish any illusions of rescue because I am leaving you unguarded. I have had it proclaimed that anyone seeking to take your body, living or dead, from the cross will be flayed alive together with all the members of his family in the public square. I am so firmly established in Khorran that my order is as good as a regiment of guardsmen. I am leaving no guard because the vultures will not approach as long as anyone is near, and I do not wish them to feel any constraint. That is also why I brought you so far from the city. These desert vultures approach the walls no closer than this spot. And so, brave captain, farewell. I will remember you when, in an hour, Taramis lies in my arms." Blood started afresh from the pierced palms as the victim's mallet-like fists clenched convulsively on the spike heads. Knots and bunches of muscle started out on the massive arms, and Conan beat his head forward and spat savagely at Constantius' face. The Wavod laughed coolly, wiped the saliva from his gorget, and reined his horse about. "Remember me when the vultures are tearing at your living flesh," he called mockingly. "The desert scavengers are a particularly voracious breed. I have seen men hang for hours on a cross, eyeless, earless, and scalpless before the sharp beaks had eaten their way into their vital." Without a backward glance, he rode toward the city, a supple, erect figure, gleaming in his burnished armor, his stolid, bearded henchman jogging beside him. A faint rising of dust from the worn trail marked their passing. The man hanging on the cross was the one touch of sentient life in the landscape that seemed desolate and deserted in the late evening. Khorran, less than a mile away, might have been on the other side of the world and existing in another age. Shaking the sweat out of his eyes, Conan stared blankly at the familiar terrain. On either side of the city and beyond it stretched the fertile meadowlands, with cattle browsing in the distance where fields and vineyards checkered the plain. The western and northern horizons were dotted with villages, miniature in the distance. A lesser distance to the southeast, a silvery gleam marked the course of a river, And beyond that river, sandy desert began to abruptly
I'll
stretch
be right
away and
back.
away
And then
beyond the
we'll like
horizon.
round two.
Conan stared at that expanse of empty waste, shimmering tawnily in the late sunlight, as a trapped hawk stares at the open sky. A revulsion shook him when he glanced at the gleaming towers of Koran. The city had betrayed him, trapped him into circumstances that left him hanging on a wooden cross like a hare nailed to a tree. A red lust for vengeance swept away the thought. Curses ebbed fitfully from the man's lips. All his universe contracted, focused, became incorporated in the four iron spikes that held him from life and freedom. His great muscles quivered, knotting like iron cables. With the sweat starting out on his graying skin, he sought to gain leverage to tear the nails from the wood. It was useless. They had been driven deep. Then he tried to tear his hands off the spikes, and it was not the knifing, abysmal agony that finally caused him to cease his efforts, but the futility of it. The spike heads were broad and heavy. He could not drag them through the wounds. A surge of helplessness shook the giant. For the first time in his life, he hung motionless, his head resting on his breast, shutting his eyes against the aching glare of the sun. A beat of wings caused him to look just as a feathered shadow shot down out of the sky. A keen beak stabbing at his eyes cut his cheek, and he jerked his head aside, shutting his eyes involuntarily. He shouted, a croaking, desperate shout of menace, and the vultures swerved away and retreated, frightened by the sound. They resumed their wary circling above his head. Blood trickled over Conan's mouth, and he licked his lips involuntarily, spat at the salty taste. Thirst assailed him savagely. He had drunk deeply of wine the night before, and no water had touched his lips since before the battle in the square that dawn. And killing was thirsty, salt, sweaty work. He glared at the distant rivers, and man in hell glares through his opened grill. He thought of gushing freshets of white water he had breasted, laved to the shoulders in liquid jade. He remembered great horns of foaming ale, jacks of sparkling wine gulped carelessly or spilled on the tavern floor. He bit his lip to keep from bellowing in intolerable anguish as a tortured animal bellows. The sun sank, a lurid ball in a fiery sea of blood. Against a crimson rampart that banded the horizon, the towers of the city floated unreal as a dream. The very sky was tinged with blood to his misted glare. He licked his blackened lips and stared with bloodshot eyes at the distant river. It too seemed crimson like blood, and the shadows crawling up from the east seemed black as ebony. In his dulled ears sounded the louder beat of wings. Lifting his head, he watched with the burning glare of a wolf the shadows wheeling above them. He knew that his shouts would frighten them away no longer. One dipped, lower and lower. Conan drew his head back as far as he could, waiting with terrible patience. The vulture swept in with a swift roar of wings. Its beak flashed down, ripping the skin on Conan's chin as he jerked his head aside. Then, before the bird could flash away, Conan's head lunged forward on his mighty neck muscles, and his teeth, snapping like those of a wolf, locked on the bare, wattled neck. Instantly, the vulture exploded into squawking, flapping hysteria. Its thrashing wings blinded the man, its talons ripped his chest, but grimly he hung on, the muscles starting out in lumps on his jaws, and the scavenger's neck bones crunched beneath those powerful teeth.
Round two.
With a spasmodic flutter, the bird hung limp. Conan let go, spat blood from his mouth. The other vultures, terrified by the fate of their companion, were in full flight to a distant tree, where they perched like black demons in conclave. Ferocious triumph surged through Conan's numbed brain. Life flowed strongly and savagely through his veins. He could still deal death. He still lived. Every twinge of sensation, even of agony, was a negation of death. By Mitra! Either a voice spoke, or he suffered from a hallucination. In all my life I have never seen such a thing. Shaking the sweat and blood from his eyes, Conan saw 4 horsemen sitting their steeds in the twilight and staring up at him. 3 were lean, white-robed hawks, zwag-eared tribesmen without a doubt, nomads from beyond the river. The other was dressed like them in a white, girdled khalat and flowing headdress which, banded about the temples with a triple circlet of braided camel hair, fell to his shoulders. But he was not a Shemite. The dust was not so thick, nor Conan's hawk-like sight so clouded that he could not perceive the man's facial characteristics. He was as tall as Conan, though not so heavy-limbed. His shoulders were broad, and his supple figure was hard as steel and whalebone. The short black beard did not altogether mask the aggressive jut of his lean jaw, and gray eyes, cold and piercing as a sword, gleamed from the shadow of the kafir. Quieting his restless steed with a quick, sure hand, this man spoke. By Mitra, I should know this man. I. It was the guttural accents of a Zwagir. It is the Cimmerian who was the captain of the Queen's Guard. She must be casting off all her old favorites, muttered the rider. Who'd ever have thought it of Queen Teramis? I'd rather have had a long, bloody war. It would have given us desert folk a chance to plunder. As it is, we've come this close to the walls and found only this nag. He glanced at a fine gelding led by one of the nomads. And this dying dog. Conan lifted his bloody head. If I could come down from this beam, I'd make a dying dog out of you, you Zaporaskan thief, he rasped through blackened lips. Mitra, the knave, knows me, exclaimed the other. How, knave, do you know me? There's only one of your breed in these parts, muttered Conan. You're Olgerd Vladislav, the outlaw chief. Aye, and once a hitman of the Kozaki of the Zaporaskan River, as you have guessed. Would you like to live? Only a fool would ask that question, panted Conan. I am a hard man, said Olgerd, and toughness is the only quality I respect in a man. I shall judge if you are a man or only a dog after all, fit only to lie here and die. If we cut him down, we may be seen from the walls, objected one of the nomads. Olgerd shook his head. The dusk is deep. Here, take this axe, Jabal, and cut down the cross at the base. If it falls forward, it will crush him, objected Jabal. I can cut it so it will fall backward, but the shock of the fall may crack his skull and tear loose all his entrails. If he's worthy to ride with me, he'll survive it, answered Olgerd imperturbably. If not, then he doesn't deserve to live. Cut. The first impact of the battle axe against the wood and its accompanying vibration sent lances of agony through Conan's swollen feet and hands. Again and again the blade fell, and each stroke reverberated on his bruised brain, setting his tortured nerves aquiver. But he set his teeth and made no sound. The axe cut through. The cross reeled on its splintered base and toppled backward. Conan made his whole body a solid knot of iron-hard muscle, jammed his head back hard against the wood and held it rigid there. The beam struck the ground heavily and rebounded slightly. The impact tore his wounds and dazed him for an instant. He fought the rushing tide of blackness, sick and dizzy, but realized that the iron muscles that sheathed his vitals had saved him from permanent injury. And he had made no sound. The blood oozed from his nostrils and his belly muscles quivered with nausea. With a grunt of approval, Jabal bent over him with a pair of pincers used to draw horseshoes and gripped the head of the spike in Conan's right hand, tearing the skin to get a grip on the deeply embedded head. The pincers were small for that work. Jabal sweated and tugged, swearing and wrestling with the stubborn iron, working it back and forth in swollen flesh as well as in wood. Blood started oozing over the Cimmerian's fingers. He lay so still that he might have been dead, except for the spasmodic rise and fall of his great chest. The spike gave way, and Jabal held up the blood-stained thing with a grunt of satisfaction, then flung it away and bent over the other. The process was repeated, and then Jabal turned his attention to Conan's skewered feet. But the Cimmerian, struggling up to a sitting posture, wrenched the pincers from his fingers and sent him staggering backward with a violent shove. Conan's hands were swollen to almost twice their normal size. His fingers felt like misshapen thumbs. Enclosing his hands was an agony that brought blood streaming from under his grinding teeth. But somehow, clutching the pincers clumsily with both hands, he managed to wrench out first one spike and then the other. They were not driven so deeply into the wood as the others had been. He rose stiffly and stood upright on his swollen, lacerated feet, swaying drunkenly, the icy sweat dripping from his face and body. Cramps assailed him and he clamped his jaws against the desire to wrench. Olgerd, watching him impersonally, motioned toward the stolen horse. Conan stumbled toward it, and every step was a stabbing, throbbing hell that flecked his lips with bloody foam. One misshapen, groping hand fell clumsily on the saddle bow. A bloody foot somehow found the stirrup. Setting his teeth, he swung up, and he almost fainted in midair, but he came down in the saddle, and as he did so, Olgerd struck the horse sharply with his whip. The startled beast reared, and the man in the saddle swayed and slumped like a sack of sand, almost unseated. Conan had wrapped a rein about each hand, holding it in place with a clamping thumb. Drunkenly, he exerted the strength of his knotted biceps, wrenching the horse down. It screamed, its jaw almost dislocated. One of the Shemites lifted a water flask questioningly.
Olgert shook his head. Let him wait until we get to camp. It's only 10 miles. If he's fit to live in the desert, he'll live that long without a drink.
The group rode like swift ghosts toward the river. Among them, Conan swayed like a drunken man in the saddle, bloodshot eyes glazed, foam drying on his blackened lips. Chapter 3. A Letter to Numidia. The savant Astraeus, traveling in the East in his never-tiring search for knowledge, wrote a letter to his friend and fellow philosopher Alcibiades in his native Numidia, which constitutes the entire knowledge of the Western nations concerning the events of that period in the East, always a hazy, half-mythical region in the minds of Western folk. Astraeus wrote in part,
You can scarcely conceive, my dear old friend, of the conditions now existing in this tiny kingdom since Queen Taramis admitted Constantius into his mercenary, an event which I briefly described in my last buried letter. 7 months have passed since then, during which time it seems as though the devil himself had been loosed in this unfortunate realm. Taramis seems to have gone quite mad. Whereas formerly she was famed for her virtue, justice, and tranquility, she is now notorious for qualities precisely opposite to those just enumerated. Her private life is a scandal, but perhaps private is not the correct term, since the Queen makes no attempt to conceal the debauchery of her court. She constantly indulges in the most infamous revelries, in which the unfortunate ladies of the court are forced to join, young married women as well as virgins. She herself has not bothered to marry her paramour, Constantius, who now sits on the royal throne beside her and reigns as her royal consort, and his officers follow his example and do not hesitate to debauch any woman they desire, regardless of her rank or station. The wretched kingdom groans under exorbitant taxation. The farms are stripped to the bone, and the merchants go in rags, which are all that is left them by the tax gatherers. Nay, they are lucky if they escape with a whole skin. I sense your incredulity, good Alcibiades. You will fear that I exaggerate conditions in Khoran. Such conditions would be unthinkable in any of the Western countries, admittedly. But you must realize the vast difference that exists between West and East, especially this part of the East. In the first place, Khoran is a kingdom of no great size, one of the many principalities which at one time formed the eastern part of the Empire of Koth, and which later regained the independence which was theirs at a still earlier age. This part of the world is made up of these tiny realms, diminutive in comparison with the great kingdoms of the West or the great sultanates of the farther East, but important in their control of the caravan routes and in the wealth concentrated in them. Khoran is the most southeasterly of these principalities, bordering on the very deserts of eastern Shem. The city of Khoran is the only city of any magnitude in the realm, and stands within sight of the river which separates the grasslands from the sandy desert, like a watchtower to guard the fertile meadow behind it. The land is so rich that it yields 3 and 4 crops a year, and the plains north and west of the city are dotted with villages. To one accustomed to the great plantations and stock farms of the West, it is strange to see these tiny fields and vineyards, yet wealth in grain and fruit pours from them as from a horn of plenty. The villagers are agriculturalists, nothing else. Of a mixed aboriginal race, they are unwarlike, unable to protect themselves, and forbidden the possession of arms. Dependent wholly upon the soldiers of the city for protection, they are helpless under the present conditions. So the savage revolt of the rural sections, which would be a certainty in any Western nation, is here impossible. They toil supinely under the iron hand of Constantius, and his black-bearded Shemites ride incessantly through the fields with whips in their hands, like the slave drivers of the black serfs who toil in the plantations of southern Zingara. Nor do the people of the city fare any better. Their wealth is stripped from them, their fairest daughters taken to glut the insatiable lust of Constantius and his mercenaries. These men are utterly without mercy or compassion, possessed of all the characteristics our army learned to abhor in our wars against the Shemite allies of Argos: inhuman cruelty, lust, and wild beast ferocity. people of the city are Khoran's ruling caste, predominantly Hyborian and valorous and warlike. But the treachery of their queen delivered them into the hands of their oppressors. The Shemites are the only armed force in Khoran, and the most hellish punishment is inflicted on any Khorani found possessing weapons. The systematic persecution to destroy the young Khorani men able to bear arms has been savagely pursued. Many have ruthlessly been slaughtered, others sold as slaves to the Turanians. Thousands have fled the kingdom and either entered the service of other rulers or become outlaws, lurking in numerous bands along the borders. At present, there is some possibility of invasion from the desert, which is inhabited by tribes of Shemitish nomads. The mercenaries of Constantius are men from the Shemitish cities of the west, Belishtim, Anakim, Akarim, and are ardently hated by the Zwagirs and other wandering tribes. As you know, good Alcemides, the countries of these barbarians are divided into the western meadowlands, which stretch to the distant ocean, and in which rise the cities of the town dwellers, and the eastern deserts where the lean nomads hold sway. There is incessant warfare between the dwellers of the cities and the dwellers of the desert. The Zwagirs have fought with and raided Khoran for centuries without success, but they resent its conquest by their western kin. It is rumored that their natural antagonism is being fomented by the man who was formerly the captain of the Queen's Guard, and who, somehow escaping the hate of Constantius, who actually had him upon the cross, fled to the nomads. He is called Conan, and is himself a barbarian, one of those gloomy Cimmerians whose ferocity our soldiers have more than once learned to their bitter cost. It is rumored that he has become the right-hand man of Olgerd Vladislav, the Cossack adventurer who wandered down from the northern steppes and made himself chief of a band of Zwagirs. There are also rumors that this band has increased vastly in the last few months, and that Olgerd, incited, no doubt, by this Cimmerian, is even considering a raid on Khoran. It cannot be anything more than a raid, as the Zwagirs are without siege machines or the knowledge of investing a city, and it has been proven repeatedly in the past that the nomads in their loose formation, or rather lack of formation, are no match in hand-to-hand fighting for the well-disciplined, fully armed warriors of the Shemitish cities. The natives of Khoran would perhaps welcome this conquest, since the nomads could deal with them no more harshly than their present masters, and even total extermination would be preferable to the suffering they have to endure. But they are so cowed and helpless that they could give no aid to the invaders. Their plight is most wretched. Taramis, apparently possessed of a demon, stops at nothing. She has abolished the worship of Ishtar and turned the temple into a shrine of idolatry. She has destroyed the ivory image of the goddess, which these Eastern Hyborians worship, and which, inferior as it is to the true religion of Mitra, which we Western nations recognize, is still superior to the devil worship of the Shemites, and filled the temple of Ishtar with obscene images of every imaginable sort, gods and goddesses of the night, portrayed in all the salacious and perverse poses with all the revolting characteristics that a degenerate brain could conceive. Many of these images are to be identified as the foul deities of the Shemites, the Turanians, the Vengians, and the Hitans, but others are reminiscent of a hideous and half-remembered antiquity. Vile shapes, forgotten except in the most obscure legends. Where the queen gained the knowledge of them, I dare not even hazard a guess. She has instituted human sacrifice, and since her mating with Constantius, no less than 500 men, women, and children have been immolated. Some of these have died on the altar that she set up in the temple, herself wielding the sacrificial dagger, but most have met a more horrible doom. Taramis has placed some sort of monster in the crypt in the temple. What it is and whence it came, none knows, but shortly after she had crushed the desperate revolt of her soldiers against Constantius, she spent a night alone in the desecrated temple. Alone except for a dozen bound captives, and the shuddering people saw thick, foul-smelling smoke curling up from the dome. Heard all night the frenetic chanting of the queen and the agonized cries of her tortured captives, and toward dawn another voice mingled with these sounds, a strident inhuman croaking that froze the blood of all who heard. In the full dawn, Taramis reeled drunkenly from the temple, her eyes blazing with demoniac triumph. The captives were never seen again, nor the croaking voice heard. But there is a room in the temple into which none ever goes but the queen, driving a human sacrifice before her, and this victim is never seen again. All know that in that grim chamber lurks some monster from the black night of the ages which devours the shrieking victims Taramis delivers up to it. I can no longer think of her as a mortal woman, but as a rabid she-fiend crouching in her blood-fouled lair amongst the bones and fragments of her victims, with taloned crimson fingers. That the gods allow her to pursue her awful course unchecked almost shakes my faith in divine justice. When I compare her present conduct with her deportment when first I came to Koran 7 months ago, I am confused with bewilderment and almost inclined to the belief held by many of the people that a demon has possessed the body of Taramis. A young soldier, Valerius, had another belief. He believed that a witch had assumed a form identical with that of Koran's adored ruler. He believed that Taramis had been spirited away in the night and confined in some dungeon, and that this being ruling in her place was but a female sorcerer. He swore that he would find the real queen if she still lived, but I greatly fear that he himself has fallen victim to the cruelty of Constantius. He was implicated in a revolt of the palace guards and escaped, and remained in hiding for some time, stubbornly refusing to seek safety abroad. And it was during this time that I encountered him, and he told me his beliefs. But he has disappeared, as so many have, whose fate one dares not conjecture, and I fear he has been apprehended by the spies of Constantius. But I must conclude this letter and slip it out of the city by means of a swift carrier pigeon, which will carry it to the post whence I purchased it on the borders of Koth. By rider and camel train it will eventually come to you. I must haste before dawn. It is late, the stars gleam whitely on the gardened roofs of Koran. A shuddering silence envelops the city, in which I hear the throb of a sullen drum from the distant temple. I doubt not that Taramis is there, concocting more deviltry. But the savant was incorrect in his conjecture concerning the whereabouts of the woman he called Taramis. The girl whom the world knew as the Queen of Koran stood in a dungeon, lighted only by a flickering torch which played on her features, etching the diabolical cruelty of her beautiful countenance. On the bare stone floor before her crouched a figure whose nakedness was scarcely covered with tattered rags. This figure Salome touched contemptuously with the upturned toe of her gilded sandal, and smiled vindictively as her victim shrank away. "You do not love my caresses, sweet sister?" Taramis was still beautiful, in spite of her rags and the imprisonment and abuse of 7 weary months. She did not reply to her sister's taunts, but bent her head as one grown accustomed to mockery. This resignation did not please Salome. She bit her red lip and stood tapping the toe of her shoe against the flags as she frowned down at the passive figure. Salome was clad in the barbaric splendor of a woman of Shushan. Jewels glittered on the torchlight on her gilded sandals, on her gold breastplates, and the slender chains that held them in place. Gold anklets clashed as she moved, jeweled bracelets weighed on her bare arms. Her tall coiffure was that of a Shemitish woman, and jade pennants hung from gold hoops in her ears, flashing and sparkling with each impatient movement of her haughty head. A gem-crusted girdle supported a silk shirt so transparent that it was in the nature of a cynical mockery of convention. Suspended from her shoulders and trailing down her back hung a darkly scarlet cloak, and this was thrown carelessly over the crook of one arm and the bundle that arm supported. Salome stooped suddenly, and with her free hand grasped her sister's disheveled hair and forced back the girl's head to stare into her eyes. Taramis met that tigerish glare without flinching. "You are not so ready with your tears as formerly, sweet sister," muttered the witch girl. "You shall wring no more tears from me," answered Taramis. "Too often you have reveled in the spectacle of the Queen of Koran sobbing for mercy on her knees. I know that you have spared me only to torment me. That is why you have limited your tortures to such torments as will neither slay nor permanently disfigure. But I fear you no longer. You have strained out the last vestige of hope, fright, and shame from me. Slay me and be done with it, for I have shed my last tear for your enjoyment, you she-devil from hell.
You flatter yourself, my dear sister.
Heard Salome.
So far it is only your handsome body that I have caused to suffer, only your pride and self-esteem that I have crushed. You forget that, unlike myself, you are capable of mental torment. I have observed this when I regaled you with narratives concerning the comedies I have enacted with some of your stupid subjects. But this time I have brought more vivid proof of these farces. Do you know that Crowlades, your faithful counselor, had come skulking back from Turan and been captured?
Taramis turned pale.
What have you done to him?
For answer, Salome drew the mysterious bundle from under her cloak. She shook off the silken swathings and held it up. The head of a young man, the features frozen in a convulsion as if death had come in the midst of inhuman agony. Taramis cried out as if a blade had pierced her heart.
Oh, Ishtar! Crowlades! Aye, he was seeking to stir up the people against me, poor fool, telling them that Conan spoke the truth when he said I was not Taramis. How should the people rise against the Falcon's Shemites? With sticks and pebbles? Ha ha! The dogs are eating his headless body in the marketplace, and this foul carrion shall be cast into the sewer to rot. How, sister?
She paused, smiling down at her victim.
Have you discovered that you still have unshed tears? Good. I reserve the mental torment for the last. Hereafter I shall show you many such signs as this.
Standing there in the torchlight with the severed head in her hand, she did not look like anything ever borne by a human woman, in spite of her awful beauty. Taramis did not look up. She lay face down on the slimy floor, her slim body shaken in sobs of agony, beating her clenched hands against the stones. Salome sauntered toward the door, her anklets clashing at each step, her ear pendants winking in the torch glare. A few moments later, she emerged from a door under a sullen arch that led into a court, which in turn opened upon a winding alley. A man standing there turned toward her, a giant Shemite with somber eyes and shoulders like a bull, his great black beard falling over his mighty silver-nailed breast. She wept. His rumble was like that of a bull, deep, low-pitched, and stormy. He was the general of the mercenaries, one of the few even of Constantius' associates who knew the secrets of the queens of Khoran.
Aye, Kumbhanagash, there are whole sections of her sensibilities that I have not touched. When one sense is dulled by continual laceration, I will discover a newer, more poignant pang. Here, dog.
A trembling, shambling figure in rags, filth, and matted hair approached one of the beggars that slept in the alleys and open courts. Salome tossed the head to him.
Here, deaf one, cast that in the nearest sewer. Make the sign with your hands, Kumbhanagash, he cannot hear.
The general complied, and the tousled head bobbed as the man turned painfully away. "Why do you keep up this farce?" rumbled Kumbhanagash. "You are so firmly established on the throne that nothing can unseat you. What if Khorani fools learn the truth? They can do nothing. Proclaim yourself in your true identity. Show them their beloved ex-queen and cut off her head in the public square."
Not yet, good Kumbhanagash.
The arched door slammed on the hard accents of Salome, the stormy reverberations of Kumbhanagash. The mute beggar crouched in the courtyard, and there was none to see that his hands which held the severed head were quivering strongly. Brown, sinewy hands, strangely incongruous with the bent body and filthy tatters.
I knew it.
It was a fierce, vibrant whisper, scarcely audible.
She lives. Oh, Crowlades, your martyrdom was not in vain. They have her locked in the dungeon. Oh, Ishtar, if you love true men, aid me now.
Chapter 4. Wolves of the Desert. Olgerd Vladislav filled his jeweled goblet with crimson wine from a golden jug and thrust the vessel across the ebony table to Conan the Cimmerian. Olgerd's apparel would have satisfied the vanity of any Zaporaskan hetman. His khalat was of white silk with pearls sewn on the bosom. Girdled at the waist with a Bakhariot belt,
Its skirts were drawn back
All right.
to reveal his
Getting for
wide
the wolf.
silken breeks, tucked into short boots of soft green leather adorned with gold thread. On his head was a green silk turban wound around a spired helmet chased with gold. His only weapon was a broad curved Cherkese knife in an ivory sheath girdled high on his left hip, Cossack fashion. Throwing himself back in his
First
gilded
movie.
chair with its carving
Yeah, it's
eagles,
been a while
Olgerd
since I've
spread
seen
his
the first
booted
one.
legs before him and gulped
I'll
down the
be right back.
sparkling wine noisily. To his splendor, the huge Cimmerian opposite him offered a strong contrast with his square-cut black mane, brown scarred countenance, and burning blue eyes. He was clad in black mesh mail, and the only glitter about him was the broad gold buckle of the belt which supported his sword in its worn leather scabbard. They were alone in the silk-walled tent, which was hung with gilt-worked tapestries and littered with rich carpets and velvet cushions, the loot of the caravans. From outside came a low, incessant murmur, the sound that always accompanies a great throng of men in camp or otherwise. An occasional gust of desert wind rattled the palm leaves.
Today in the shadow, tomorrow in the sun,
quoth Olgerd, loosening his crimson girdle a trifle and reaching again for the wine jug.
That's the way of life. Once I was a hetman on the Zaporoska, now I'm a desert chief. 7 months ago, you were hanging on a cross outside of Koran. Now you're lieutenant of the most powerful raider between Toran and the Western Meadows. You should be thankful to me.
For recognizing my usefulness? Conan laughed and lifted the jug. When you allow the elevation of a man, one can be sure that you'll profit by his advancement. I've earned everything I've won with my blood and sweat. He glanced at the scars on the insides of his palms. There were scars, too, on his body, scars that had not been there 7 months ago.
You fight like a regiment of devils, conceded Olgerd, but don't get to thinking that you've had anything to do with the recruits who've swarmed to join us. It was our success at raiding, guided by my wit, that brought them in. These nomads are always looking for a successful leader to follow, and they have more faith in a foreigner than one of their own race. There's no limit to what we may accomplish. We have 11,000 men now. In another year, we may have 3 times that number. We've contented ourselves so far with raids on the Turanian outposts and the city-states to the west. With 30 or 40,000 men, we'll raid no longer. We'll invade and conquer and establish ourselves as rulers. I'll be emperor of all Shem yet, and you'll be my vizier, so long as you carry out my orders unquestioningly. In the meantime, I think we'll ride eastward and storm that Turanian outpost at Vezek, where the caravans pay toll.
Conan shook his head. I think not. Olgerd glared, his quick temper irritated.
What do you mean you think not? I do the thinking for this army.
There are men enough in this band now for my purpose, answered the Cimmerian. I'm sick of waiting. I have a score to settle.
Oh,
Olgerd scowled and gulped wine, thin grin.
still thinking of that cross, eh? Well, I like a good hater, but that can wait.
You told me once you'd aid me in taking Koran, said Conan.
Yes, but that was before I began to see the full possibilities of our power, answered Olgerd. I was only thinking of the loot in the city. I don't want to waste our strength unprofitably. Koran is too strong a nut for us to crack now. Maybe in a year.
Within the week, answered Conan, and the Cossack stared at the certainty in his voice.
Listen, said Olgerd, even if I were willing to throw away men on such a harebrained attempt, what could you expect? Do you think these wolves would besiege and take a city like Koran?
There'll be no siege, answered the Cimmerian. I know how to draw Constantius out into the plain.
And what then?
cried Olgerd with an oath.
In the arrow play, our horsemen would have the worst of it, for the armor of the Ashuri is the better. And when it came to sword strokes, their close-marshaled ranks of trained swordsmen would cleave through our loose lines and scatter our men like chaff before the wind.
Not if there were 3,000 desperate Hyborian horsemen fighting in a solid wedge, such as I could teach them, answered Conan.
And where would you secure 3,000 Hyborians?
Asked Olgerd with vast sarcasm.
Would you conjure them out of the air?
I have them, answered Conan imperturbably. 3,000 men of Koran camp at the oasis of Akrel, awaiting my orders.
What?
Olgerd glared like a startled wolf. Aye, men who had fled from the tyranny of Constantius,
Most of them have been living the lives of outlaws in the desert east of Quran and are gaunt and hard and desperate as man-eating tigers. One of them will be a match for any 3 squatting mercenaries. It takes oppression and hardship to stiffen men's guts and put the fire of hell into their thews. They were broken up into small bands. All they needed was a leader. They believed the word I sent them by my riders and assembled at the oasis and put themselves at my disposal. All of this without my knowledge? A feral light began to gleam in Olgird's eye. He hitched at his weapon girdle. It was I they wished to follow, not you. And what did you tell these outcasts to gain their allegiance? There was a dangerous ring in Olgird's voice. I told them that I'd use this horde of desert wolves to help them destroy Constantius and give Koran back into the hands of its citizens. You fool, whispered Olgird. You deem yourself chief already? The men were on their feet, facing each other across the ebony board, devil lights dancing in Olgird's cold gray eyes and a grim smile on the Cimmerian's hard lips. I'll have you torn between 4 palm trees, said the Cossack calmly. Call them in and bid them do it, challenged Conan. See if they obey you. Baring his teeth in a snarl, Olgird lifted his hand and then paused. There was something about the confidence in the Cimmerian's dark face that shook him. His eyes began to burn like those of a wolf. You scum of the Western Hills, he muttered. Have you dared to seek to undermine my power? I didn't have to, answered Conan. You lied when you said I had nothing to do with bringing in the new recruits. I had everything to do with it. They took your orders, but they fought for me. There is not room for 2 chiefs of the Zwagir. They know I am the stronger man. I understand them better than you, and they me, because I am a barbarian too. And what will they say when you ask them to fight for Koran? Asked Olgird sardonically. They'll follow me. I'll promise them a camel train of gold from the palace. Koran will be willing to pay that as a guerdon for getting rid of Constantius. After that, I'll lead them against the Turanians, as you have planned. They want loot, and they'd just as soon fight Constantius for it as anybody. In Olgird's eyes grew a recognition of defeat. In his red dreams of empire, he had missed what was going on about him. Happenings and events that had seemed meaningless before now flashed into his mind with their true significance, bringing a realization that Conan spoke no idle boast. The giant black-mailed figure before him was the real chief of the Zwagirs. Not if you die, muttered Olgird, and his hand flickered toward his hilt. But quick as a stroke of a great cat, Conan's arm shot across the table and his fingers locked on Olgird's forearm. There was a snap of breaking bones, and for a tense instant the scene held, the men facing each other as motionless as images, perspiration starting out on Olgird's forehead. Conan laughed, never easing his grip on the broken arm. Are you fit to live, Olgird? The smile did not alter. The corded muscles rippled in knotting ridges along his forearm, and his fingers ground into the Kozak's quivering flesh. There was the sound of broken bones grating together, and Olgird's face turned the color of ashes. Blood oozed from his lip where his teeth sank, but he uttered no sound. With a laugh, Conan released him and drew back, and the Kozak swayed, caught the table edge with his good hand to steady himself. I give you life, Olgird, as you gave it to me, said Conan tranquilly, though it was for your own ends that you took me down from the cross. It was a bitter test you gave me then. You couldn't have endured it. Neither could anyone but a Western barbarian. Take your horse and go. It's tied behind the tent, and food and water are in the saddlebags. None will see you're going, but go quickly. There's no room for a fallen chief on the desert. If the warriors see you maimed and deposed, they'll never let you leave the camp alive. Olgird did not reply. Slowly, without a word, he turned and stalked across the tent through the flapped opening. Unspeaking, he climbed into the saddle of the great white stallion that stood tethered there in the shade of a spreading palm tree, and unspeaking, with his broken arm thrust in the bosom of his khalat, he reined the steed about and rode eastward into the open desert, out of the life of the people of the Zwagir. Inside the tent, Conan emptied the wine jug and smacked his lips with relish. Tossing the empty vessel into a corner, he braced his belt and strode out through the front opening, halting for a moment to let his gaze sweep over the lines of camel hair tents that stretched before him and the white-robed figures that moved among them, arguing, singing, mending bridles, or whetting tulwars. He lifted his voice in a thunder that carried to the farthest confines of the encampment. Aye, you dogs, sharpen your ears and listen. Gather around here. I have a tale to tell you.
Chapter 5. The Voice from the Crystal. In a chamber, in a tower, near the city wall, a group of men listened attentively to the words of one of their number. They were young men, but hard and sinewy, with a bearing that comes only to men rendered desperate by adversity. They were clad in mail shirts and worn leather. Swords hung at their girdles.
I knew that Conan spoke the truth when he said it was not Taramis,
The speaker exclaimed.
For months I have haunted the outskirts of the palace, playing the part of a deaf beggar. At last I learned what I had believed, that our queen was a prisoner in the dungeons that adjoined the palace. I watched my opportunity and captured a Shemitish jailer, knocked him senseless as he left the courtyard late one night, dragged him into a cellar nearby and questioned him. Before he died, he told me what I have just told you, and what we have suspected all along, that the woman ruling Khorran is a witch, Salome. Taramis, he said, is imprisoned in the lowest dungeon. This invasion of the Zwagirs gives us the opportunity we sought. What Conan means to do, I cannot say. Perhaps he merely wishes vengeance on Constantius. Perhaps he intends sacking the city and destroying it. He is a barbarian, and no one can understand their minds. But this is what we must do. Rescue Taramis while the battle rages. Constantius will march out into the plain to give battle. Even now his men are mounting. He will do this because there is not sufficient food in the city to withstand a siege. Conan burst out of the desert so suddenly that there was no time to bring in supplies, and the Cimmerian is equipped for a siege. Scouts have reported that the Zwagirs have siege engines, built undoubtedly according to the instructions of Conan, who learned all the arts of war among the western nations. Constantius does not desire a long siege, so he will march with his warriors into the plain, where he expects to scatter Conan's forces at one stroke. He will leave only a few hundred men in the city, and they will be on the walls and in the towers, commanding the gates. The prison will be left all but unguarded. When we have freed Taramis, our next actions will depend upon circumstances. If Conan wins, we must show Taramis to the people and bid them rise. Oh, they will. With their bare hands they are enough to overpower the Shemites left in the city and close the gates against both mercenaries and the nomads. Neither must get within the walls. Then we will parley with Conan. He was always loyal to Taramis. If he knows the truth and she appeals to him, I believe he will spare the city. If, which is more probable, Constantius prevails and Conan is routed, we must steal out of the city with the queen and seek safety in flight. Is it all clear?
They replied with one voice.
Then let us loosen our blades in our scabbards, commend our souls to Ishtar, and start for the prison, for the mercenaries are already marching through the southern gate.
This was true. The dawnlight glinted on peaked helmets pouring in a steady stream through the broad arch, on the bright housings of the chargers. This would be a battle of horsemen, such as is possible only in the lands of the east. The riders flowed through the gates like a river of steel, somber figures in black and silver mail, with their curled beards and hooked noses, and their inexorable eyes in which glittered the fatality of their race, the utter lack of doubt or of mercy. The streets and the walls were lined with throngs of people who watched silently these warriors of an alien race riding forth to defend their native city. There was no sound. Dully expressionless they watched, these gaunt people in shabby garments, their caps in their hands. In a tower that overlooked the broad street that led to the southern gate, Salome lolled on a velvet couch, cynically watching Constantius as he settled his broad sword belt about his lean hips and drew on his gauntlets. They were alone in the chamber. Outside, the rhythmical clank of harness and shuffle of horses' hoofs welled up through the gold-barred casements.
Before nightfall,
quoth Constantius, giving a twirl to his thin mustache,
you'll have some captives to feed to your temple devil.
does it not grow weary of soft, city-bred flesh?
Perhaps it would relish the harder thews of a desert man.
Take care you do not fall prey to a fiercer beast than Thorg,
warned the girl.
Do not forget who it is that leads these desert animals.
I am not likely to forget,
He answered.
That is one reason why I am advancing to meet him. The dog has fought in the west and knows the art of siege. My scouts had some trouble in approaching his columns, for his outriders have eyes like hawks, but they did get close enough to see the engines he is dragging on ox cart wheels drawn by the camels. Catapults, rams, ballistas, mangonels. By Ishtar, he must have had 10,000 men working day and night for a month. Where he got the material for their construction is more than I can understand. Perhaps he has a treaty with the Turanians and gets supplies from them. Anyway, it won't do him any good. I've fought these desert wolves before, an exchange of arrows for a while in which the armor of my warriors protects them. Then a charge and my squadrons sweep through the loose swarms of the nomads, wheel and sweep back through, scattering them to the four winds. I'll ride back through the south gate before sunset with hundreds of naked captives staggering at my horse's tail. We'll hold a fete tonight in the great square. My soldiers delight in flaying their enemies alive. We'll have a wholesale skinning and make these weak-kneed townsfolk watch. As for Conan, it will afford me intense pleasure, if we take him alive, to impale him on the palace steps. Skin as many as you like, answered Salome indifferently. I would like a dress made of human hide, but at least 100 captives you must give to me, for the altar and for Thor. It shall be done, answered Constantius, with his gauntleted hand brushing back the thin hair from his high, bald forehead, burned dark by the sun. For victory and for the fair honor of Taramis, he said sardonically, and taking his visored helmet under his arm, he lifted a hand in salute and strode clanking from the chamber. His voice drifted back, harshly lifted in orders to his officers. Salome leaned back on the couch, yawned, stretched herself like a great supple cat, and called, Zang! A cat-footed priest with features like yellow parchment stretched over a skull entered noiselessly. Salome turned to an ivory pedestal on which stood 2 crystal globes, and taking from it the smaller, she handed the glistening spear to the priest. Ride with Constantius, she said. Give me news of the battle. Go. The skull-faced man bowed low, and hiding the globe under his dark mantle, hurried from the chamber. Outside in the city there was no sound except for the clank of hoofs, and after a while the clang of a closing gate. Salome mounted a wide marble stair that led to the flat, canopied, marble battlemented roof. She was above all other buildings in the city. The streets were deserted. The great square in front of the palace was empty. In normal times, folks shunned the grim temple which rose on the opposite side of that square, but now the town looked like a dead city. Only on the southern wall and the roofs that overlooked it was there any sign of life. There the people massed thickly. They made no demonstration, did not know whether to hope for the victory or defeat of Constantius. Victory meant further misery under his intolerable rule. Defeat probably meant the sack of the city and red massacre. No word had come from Conan. They did not know what to expect at his hands. They remembered that he was a barbarian. The squadrons of the mercenaries were moving out into the plain. In the distance, just this side of the river, other dark masses were moving, barely recognizable as men on horses. Objects dotted the farther bank. Conan had not brought his siege engines across the river, apparently fearing an attack in the midst of the crossing. But he had crossed with his full force of horsemen. The sun rose and struck glints of fire from the dark multitudes. The squadrons from the city broke into a gallop. A deep roar reached the ears of the people on the wall. The rolling masses merged, intermingled, and at that distance it was a tangled confusion in which no details stood out. Charge and countercharge were not to be identified. Clouds of dust rose from the plains under the stamping hoofs, veiling the action. Through these swirling clouds, masses of riders loomed, appearing and disappearing, and spears flashed. Salome shrugged her shoulders and descended the stair. The palace lay silent. All the slaves were on the wall, gazing vainly southward with the citizens. She entered the chamber where she had talked with Constantius and approached the pedestal, noting that the crystal globe was clouded, shot with bloody streaks of crimson. She bent over the ball, swearing under her breath. Zang, she called. Zang! Mists swirled in the sphere, resolving themselves into billowing dust clouds through which black figures rushed unrecognizably. Steel glinted like lightning in the murk. Then the face of Zang leaped into startling distinctiveness. It was as if the wide eyes gazed up at Salome. Blood trickled from a gash in the skull-like head. The skin was gray with sweat-runneled dust. The lips parted, writhing. To other ears than Salome's, it would have seemed that the face in the crystal contorted silently. But sound to her came as plainly from those ashen lips as if the priest had been in the same room with her instead of miles away, shouting into the smaller crystal. Only the gods of darkness knew what unseen magic filaments linked together those shimmering spheres. Salome! Shrieked the bloody head. Salome!
I'll be right back.
I hear, she cried. Speak! How goes the battle?
Doom is upon us,
Screamed the skull-like apparition.
Koran is lost. My horse is down and I cannot win clear. Men are falling around me. They are dying like flies in their silvered mail.
Stop yammering and tell me what happened, she cried harshly.
We rode at the desert dogs and they came to meet us,
Yelled the priest.
Arrows flew in clouds between the hosts, and the nomads wavered. Constantius ordered the charge. In even ranks we thundered upon them. Then the masses of their horde opened to the left and right, and through the cleft rushed 3,000 Hyborian horsemen whose presence we had not even suspected. Men of Koran, mad with hate, big men in full armor on massive horses. In a wedge of steel they smote like a thunderbolt. They split our ranks asunder before we knew what was upon us, and then the desert men swarmed on us from either flank. They have ripped our ranks apart, broken and scattered us. It is a trick of that devil Conan. The siege engines were false, mere frames of palm trees and painted silk that fooled our scouts who saw them from afar. A trick to draw us out to our doom. Our warriors flee. Kumbanagash is down. Conan slew him. I do not see Constantius. The Korani rage through our milling masses like blood-mad lions, and the desert men feather us with arrows.
There was a flicker as of lightning or trenchant steel, a burst of bright blood, and then, abruptly, the image vanished like a bursting bubble, and Salome was staring into an empty crystal ball that mirrored only her own furious features. She stood perfectly still for a few moments, erect and staring into space. Then she clapped her hands, and another skull-like priest entered, as silent and immobile as the other. Constantius is beaten, she said swiftly. We are doomed. Conan will be crashing at our gates within the hour. If he catches me, I have no illusions as to what I can expect. But first I am going to make sure that my cursed sister never ascends the throne again. Follow me. Come what may, we shall give Thorg a feast. As she descended the stairs and galleries of the palace, she heard a faint rising echo from the distant walls. The people there had begun to realize that the battle was going against Constantius. Through the dust clouds, masses of horsemen were visible, racing toward the city. Palace and prison were connected by a long, closed gallery whose vaulted roof rose on gloomy arches. Hurrying along this, the false queen and her slave passed through a heavy door at the other end that let them into the dim-lit recesses of the prison. They had merged into a wide, arched corridor where a stone stair descended into the darkness. Salome recoiled suddenly, swearing. In the gloom of the hall lay a motionless form, a Shemitish jailer, his short beard tilted toward the roof as his head hung on a half-severed neck. As panting voices from below reached the girl's ears, she shrank back into the black shadow of an arch, pushing the priest behind her, her hand groping in her girdle. Chapter 6. The Vulture's Wings. It was the smoky light of a torch which roused Taramis, queen of Koran, from the slumber in which she sought forgetfulness. Lifting herself on her hand, she raked back her tangled hair and blinked up, expecting to meet the mocking countenance of Salome, malign with new torments. Instead, a cry of pity and horror reached her ears. Taramis! Oh, my queen! The sound was so strange to her ears that she thought she was still dreaming. Behind the torch, she could make out figures now, the glint of steel, and 5 countenances bent toward her, not swarthy and hook-nosed, but lean, aquiline faces, browned by the sun. She crouched in her tatters, staring wildly. One of the figures sprang forward and fell on one knee before her, arms stretched appealingly toward her. Oh, Taramis! Thank Ishtar we have found you! Do you not remember me, Valerius? Once with your own lips you praised me after the Battle of Corvaca. Valerius! She stammered. Suddenly, tears welled into her eyes. Oh, I dream. It is some magic of Salome's to torment me. No! The cry rang with exultation. It is your own true vassals come to rescue you. Yet we must hasten. Constantius fights in the plain against Conan, who has brought the Zwagirs across the river. But 300 Shemites yet hold the city. We slew the jailer and took his keys and have seen no other guards, but we must be gone. Come. The queen's legs gave way, not from weakness, but from the reaction. Valerius lifted her like a child, and with the torchbearer hurrying before them, they left the dungeon and went up a slimy stone stair.
It seemed to mount endlessly, but presently they emerged into a corridor. They were passing a dark arch when the torch was suddenly struck out, and the bearer cried out in fierce, brief agony. A burst of blue fire glared in the dark corridor, in which the furious face of Salome was limned momentarily, with a beast-like figure crouching beside her, and then the eyes of the watchers were blinded by that blaze. Valerius tried to stagger along the corridor with the queen. Dazedly he heard the sound of murderous blows driven deep in flesh, accompanied by gasps of death and a bestial grunting. Then the queen was torn brutally from his arms, and a savage blow on his helmet dashed him to the floor. Grimly he crawled to his feet, shaking his head in an effort to rid himself of the blue flame which seemed still to dance devilishly before him. When his blinded sight cleared, he found himself alone in the corridor, alone except for the dead. His 4 companions lay in their blood, heads and bosoms cleft and gashed. Blinded and dazed in that hell-born glare, they had died without an opportunity of defending themselves. The queen was gone. With a bitter curse, Valerius caught up his sword, tearing his cleft helmet from his head to clatter on the flags. Blood ran down his cheek from a cut in his scalp. Reeling, frantic with indecision, he heard a voice calling his name in desperate urgency. "Valerius! Valerius!" He staggered in the direction of the voice and rounded a corner just in time to have his arms filled with a soft, supple figure which flung itself frantically at him. "Ivga, are you mad?" "I had to come," she sobbed. "I followed you, hid in the arch of the outer court. A moment ago I saw her emerge, with a brute who carried a woman in his arms. I knew it was Taramis and that you had failed, for you were hers." "A scratch." He put aside her clinging hands. "Quick, Ivga, tell me which way they went." "They fled across the square toward the temple." He paled. "Ishtar, oh, the fiend. She means to give Taramis to the devil she worships. Quick, Ivga, run to the south wall where the people watch the battle. Tell them their real queen has been found, that the impostor has dragged her to the temple. Go!" Sobbing, the girl sped away, her light sandals pattering on the cobblestones, and Valerius raced across the court, dashed into the street on which it debouched, and raced for the great structure that rose on the opposite side. His flying feet spurned the marble as he darted up the broad stair and through the pillared portico. Evidently their prisoner had given them some trouble. Taramis, sensing the doom intended for her, was fighting against it with all the strength of her splendid young body. Once she had broken away from the brutish priest, only to be dragged down again. The group was halfway down the broad nave, at the other end of which stood the grim altar, and beyond that the great metal door, obscenely carven, through which many had gone, but from which only Salome had ever emerged. Taramis' breath came in panting gasps. Her tattered garment had been torn from her in the struggle. She writhed in the grasp of her apish captor like a white, naked nymph in the arms of a satyr. Salome watched cynically, though impatiently, moving toward the carven door, and from the dusk that lurked along the lofty walls the obscene gods and gargoyles leered down, as if imbued with salacious life. Choking with fury, Valerius rushed down the hall, sword in hand. At a sharp cry from Salome, the skull-faced priest looked up, then released Taramis and drew a heavy knife, already smeared with blood, and ran at the oncoming Korani. But cutting down men blinded by the devil's flame loosed by Salome was different from fighting a wiry young Hyborian afire with hate and rage. Up went the dripping knife, but before it could fall, Valerius' keen, narrow blade slashed through the air, and the fist that held the knife jumped from its wrist in a shower of blood. Valerius, berserk, slashed again and yet again before the crumpling figure could fall. The blade licked through flesh and bone. The skull-like head fell one way, the half-sundered torso the other. Valerius whirled on his toes, quick and fierce as a jungle cat, glaring about for Salome. She must have exhausted her fire dust in the prison. She was bending over Taramis, grasping her sister's black locks in one hand and the other lifting a dagger. Then with a fierce cry, Valerius' sword was sheathed in her breast with such fury that the point sprang out between her shoulders. With an awful shriek, the witch sank down, writhing in convulsions, grasping at the naked blade as it was withdrawn, smoking and dripping. Her eyes were inhuman. With a more than human vitality, she clung to the life that ebbed through the wound that split the crimson crescent on her ivory bosom. She groveled on the floor, clawing and biting at the naked stones in her agony. Sickened at the sight, Valerius stooped and lifted the half-fainting queen.
Turning his back on the twisting figure on the floor, he ran toward the door, stumbling in his haste. He staggered out upon the portico, halted at the head of the steps. The square thronged with people. Some had come at Ivga's incoherent cries. Others had deserted the walls in fear of the on-sweeping hordes out of the desert, fleeing unreasonably toward the center of the city. Dumb resignation had vanished. The throng seethed and milled, screaming and yelling. About the road there sounded somewhere the splintering of stone and timbers. A band of grim Shemites cleft the crowd, the guards of the northern gates, hurrying toward the south gate to reinforce their comrades there. They reined up short at the sight of the youth on the steps, holding the limp, naked figure in his arms. The heads of the throng turned toward the temple. The crowd gasped. A new bewilderment added to their swirling confusion.
"Here is your queen!"
yelled Valerius, straining to make himself understood above the clamor. The people gave back a bewildered roar. They did not understand, and Valerius sought in vain to lift his voice above their bedlam. The Shemites rode toward the temple steps, beating away through the crowd with their spears. Then a new, grisly element introduced itself into the frenzy. Out of the gloom of the temple behind Valerius wavered a slim figure laced with crimson. The people screamed. There in the arms of Valerius hung the woman they thought their queen, yet there in the temple door staggered another figure, like a reflection of the other. Their brains reeled. Valerius felt his blood congeal as he stared at the swaying witch girl. His sword had transfixed her, sundered her heart. She should be dead. By all the laws of nature, she should be dead. Yet there she swayed on her feet, clinging horribly to life. "Thog!" she screamed, reeling in the doorway. "Thog!" As in answer to that frightful invocation, there boomed a thunderous croaking from within the temple, the snapping of wood and metal.
"That is the queen!"
roared the captain of the Shemites, lifting his bow.
"Shoot down the man and the other woman!"
But the roar of a roused hunting pack rose from the people. They had guessed the truth at last, understood Valerius' frenzied appeals, knew that the girl who hung limply in his arms was their true queen. With a soul-shaking yell, they surged on the Shemites, tearing and smiting with tooth and nail and naked hands, with the desperation of hard-pent fury loosed at last. Above them, Salome swayed and tumbled down the marble stairs, dead at last. Arrows flickered about him as Valerius ran back between the pillars of the portico, shielding the body of the queen with his own. Shooting and slashing ruthlessly, the mounted Shemites were holding their own with the maddened crowd. Valerius darted to the temple door. With one foot on the threshold, he recoiled, crying out in horror and despair. Out of the gloom at the other end of the great hall, a vast, dark form heaved up, coming toward him in gigantic, frog-like hops. He saw the gleam of great, unearthly eyes, the shimmer of fangs or talons. He fell back from the door, and then the whir of a shaft past his ear warned him that death was also behind him. He wheeled desperately. 4 or 5 Shemites had cut their way through the throng and were spurring their horses up the steps, their bows lifted to shoot him down. He sprang behind a pillar on which their arrows splintered. Taramis had fainted. She hung like a dead woman in his arms. Before the Shemites could loose again, the doorway was blocked by a gigantic shape. With affrighted yells, the mercenaries wheeled and began beating a frantic way back through the throng, which crushed back in sudden galvanized horror, trampling one another in their stampede. But the monster seemed to be watching Valerius and the girl. Squeezing its vast, unstable bulk through the door, it bounded toward them as he ran down the steps. He felt it looming behind, a giant, shadowy thing like a travesty of nature cut out of the heart of the night, a black shapelessness in which only the staring eyes and gleaming fangs were distinct. Then came a sudden thunder of hoofs, a rout of Shemites, bloody and battered, streaming across the square from the south, plowing blindly through the packed throng. Behind them swept a horde of horsemen, yelling in a familiar tongue, waving red swords. The exiles returned. With them rode 50 black-bearded desert riders, and at their head a giant figure in black mail. "Conan!" shrieked Valerius. "Conan!" The giant yelled a command. Without checking their headlong pace, the desert men lifted their bows, drew, and loosed. A cloud of arrows sang across the square over the seething heads of the multitudes and sank feather-deep in the black monster. It halted, wavered, reared, a black blot against the marble pillars. Again that sharp cloud sang, and yet again, and the horror collapsed and rolled down the steps, as dead as the witch who had summoned it out of the night of ages. Conan drew rein beside the portico and leaped off. Valerius had lain the queen on the marble, sinking beside her in utter exhaustion. People surged about, crowding in. The Cimmerian cursed them back, lifted her dark head, pillowed it against his mailed shoulder. By Crom, what is this? The real Paramus? But who is that yonder? The devil who wore her shape, panted Valerius. Conan swore heartily. Ripping a cloak from the shoulders of a soldier, he wrapped it around the naked queen. Her long dark lashes quivered on her cheeks, her eyes open. She stared up unbelieving into the Cimmerian's scarred face. Conan? Her soft fingers caught at him. Do I dream? She told me you were dead. Scarcely. He grinned hardly. You do not dream. You are queen of Khorran again. I broke Constantius out there by the river. Most of his dogs never reached the walls, for I gave orders that no prisoners were to be taken, except Constantius. The city guard closed the gates in our faces, but we burst in with rams swung from our saddles. I left all my wolves outside except this 50. I didn't trust them in here, and these Khorani lads were good enough for the gate guards. It has been a nightmare, she whimpered. Oh, my poor people. You must help me try to repay them for all they have suffered, Conan, henceforth counselor as well as captain. Conan laughed, but shook his head. Rising, he set the queen upon her feet and beckoned to a number of his Khorani horsemen who had not continued the pursuit of the fleeing Shemites. They sprang from their horses, eager to do the bidding of their newfound queen. No, lass, that's over with. I'm chief of the Zwagirs now, and must lead them to plunder the Turanians as I promised. This lad, Valerius, will make you a better captain than I. I wasn't made to dwell among marble walls anyway. But I must leave you now and complete what I've begun. Shemites still live in Khorran. As Valerius started to follow Taramis across the square toward the palace, through a lane opened by the wildly cheering multitude, he felt a soft hand slip timidly into his sinewy fingers and turned to receive the slender body of Ivga in his arms. He crushed her to him and drank her kisses with the gratitude of a weary fighter who has attained rest at last through tribulation and storm. But not all men seek rest and peace. Some are born with the spirit of the storm in their blood, restless harbingers of violence and bloodshed, knowing no other path. The sun was rising. The ancient caravan road was thronged with white-robed horsemen in a wavering line that stretched from the walls of Khorran to a spot far out in the plain. Conan the Cimmerian sat at the head of that column, near the jagged end of a wooden beam that stuck up out of the ground. Near that stump rose a heavy cross, and on that cross a man hung by spikes through his hands and feet. 7 months ago, Constantius, said Conan, it was I who hung there, and you who sat here. Constantius did not reply. He licked his gray lips, and his eyes were glassy with fear and pain. Muscle.
All right, everyone.
Jewels of Gwalor.
I'm going to call Intius Light for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Everyone who keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.